The history of the American frontier is filled with countless tales of some of the most brutal battles that history has ever seen. Of course, telling them in one episode is impossible. But tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we delve into 10 of the most brutal battles from the history of the Old West. Northern Texas, June 27, 1874. In the middle of the night, in the tiny settlement known as Adobe Walls, James Hanrahan stands outside of the sod-roof saloon that he owns and operates. Hanrahan is alone, cloaked in the darkness of the night, and clutching a revolver. He is visibly nervous and exhausted from lack of sleep, and, more than anything, he wishes he could go inside, pour himself a stiff drink, and drift off to sleep until dawn brings on the repressive heat of yet another blazing Texas summer day. But he knows he cannot. Hanrahan knows what he must do. He aims the pistol into the air and squeezes the trigger. The tiny settlement, comprised of only 4 buildings, is soon suddenly awash in activity as the remaining 27 men present, who are mostly recent arrivals, tired after their long journeys, are snapped out of their long-awaited slumbers to the report of the pistol. The shot sails harmlessly skyward as Hanrahan hurries back into his saloon and tucks the weapon away. As the small crowd of inhabitants who are making Adobe Walls their temporary home gather outside, questioning what the source of the loud noise was, Hanrahan stumbles back out of his sod-roof establishment, breathlessly informing them that the noise has come from the cracking of a ridgepole that holds up the heavy roof of his building. This, if it is true, is a serious problem. This is a relatively common occurrence in the Old West, and the men know that a cracked ridgepole will have to be taken out and replaced immediately. As compensation for their efforts, the bartender offers up free drinks for all those pitching in to help. As the hours drag by and the men labor and drink, Hanrahan continually casts nervous glances at the door. He knows the ridgepole is not, in fact, cracked. But he knows that in the dimly lit building, in the middle of the night, it will be difficult for even experienced repairmen to spot a small crack in the sizable ridgepole. Hanrahan's intentions are not to oversee any actual repairs, but to simply keep the men encamped here at Adobe Walls awake. He has received reports in the preceding days from informants that he keeps in the territory of a large war party gathering nearby, and, not wanting to drive away business, he has chosen not to share the reports with anyone else present. Out here on the open plains of North Texas, reliable patronage is such a rarity that withholding news of an attack in order to ensure a steady flow of income is simply the cost of doing business. Aiding in Hanrahan's self-justification is the fact that his clientele are not exemplary of the typical American citizen at the time. Even amongst the rebellious and rowdy population of Texas, the regulars who indulge themselves in gambling and hard liquor at this establishment are rare in their capacity to endure danger and violence. His clientele, and the bulk of the not quite 30-strong population of Adobe Walls, is mostly comprised of buffalo hunters and skinners, otherwise known as hidemen. They are an unusually hardened and hardy lot, born from the boom in demand for buffalo hide. This boom has come after enterprising tanners on the East Coast developed a way to soften the hide that manufacturers found suitable and in many ways ideal for making everything from boots to coats to the leather straps used in the machinery now becoming ubiquitous in major urban centers with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The buffalo hunters, who had once been employed by local army forts to harvest the mighty beasts for their meat to feed the troops, have, over the last several years, blossomed their grisly trade into its own industrialized operation. Their quarry, the imposing American bison, colloquially known as buffalo, present not only an enticing target, but an easy one for hunters familiar with their habits. The hulking animals cluster in large herds and do not flee until the lead animal among them is shot down. Over the course of the decades spanning from 1870 to 1880, the buffalo population of North America was utterly decimated. In 1870, there was thought to be more than 12 million buffalo roaming the plains. By 1880, there will be fewer than 400,000. After the animals are killed, the teams of men set about the tedious, tiresome, and outright filthy task of skinning the massive animals and then salting and harvesting the animals' tongues, which are prized delicacies in the cities on the eastern seaboard and in Europe. The carcasses are then left to rot by the thousands on the open expanses of the sun-soaked plains. This practice had increased in both pace and scope, beginning in the territory of Kansas and rapidly expanding southward and westward into the territory belonging to tribes like the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. By this point in the mid-1870s, these once powerful tribes that have forfeited large swaths of their territory to the United States government are finding themselves in increasingly dire straits. As their territorial domain recedes, and the once expansive herds of buffalo are reduced exponentially year after year, the tribes of the central and southern plains are becoming increasingly angry and increasingly desperate. Their ire is drawn, in particular, by the teams of buffalo hunters who roam their lands and cut down the animals that they depend on almost entirely for their survival. In this area of northern Texas, the Comanche have been hit particularly hard. Though they are still the most powerful tribe on the southern plains, their numbers have been decimated by outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, and cholera over the preceding few decades. Though once a mighty Spartan-like culture, nearly devoid of formalized religious practices, they have recently begun to adopt an odd and rather ad hoc adaptation of the sun dance, a ritual performed by tribes with more developed religious practices like the Kiowa and the Cheyenne. They have spent much of the past few years being perpetually pursued by the U.S. Army and intermittently wreaking havoc on Texan and Mexican settlements as they struggled to regain from the ravages of the white man's diseases. Though they are still feared throughout the whole of Texas, the Comanche people know that they are, as a whole, ailing. Thus, many among them have sought solace in medicine men, who claim to have spiritual solutions to the Comanche's temporal problems. Foremost among them is a 23-year-old, heavy-set, and broad-faced man named Isatai. Though he is not a warrior, nor does he have any experience at all in tactics or strategy or logistics, he has managed to convince the struggling and weary Comanche people that he is in possession of a great power. Throughout the spring of 1874, he had begun to foster his own legend. Comanche camps from all over the southern plains began to buzz with tales of this powerful young medicine man who, it was said, could stop bullets by casting spells, could actually fly into the sun to spend time with the spirits of the other world, and who could belch up literal wagon loads full of bullets to supply the Comanche in their fight against the whites. Now was the time, Isatai had insisted as he traveled from camp to camp, for the Comanche to rise up, to join with their allies in the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, and to finally, once and for all, drive the American invaders from their lands. Though many amongst the Comanche would likely have dismissed the young Isatai out of hand were he traveling alone, it is his close friend, the legendary warrior Quanah Parker, whose endorsement lends great credence to his claims. Quanah, the half-white son of captured Texan Cynthia Ann Parker and the Comanche chief Pettinacona, had risen to prominence as a respected warrior and a leader after being effectively orphaned when his father had been killed and his mother recaptured by the Texans in a raid a decade prior. Now, his opinions hold great sway amongst his people. In May of 1874, when the Comanche bands all gathered on the Red River for their attempt at a sun dance, Quanah and Isatai beseeched their ailing people to listen to their cries for an uprising and to follow them into the fight. Isatai had promised to make the warriors invincible and render the Texans they planned to attack completely helpless with his powerful magic. They had managed to recruit warriors from their allies in the Kiowa and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, and now, after much speech-giving and testimony, they convinced many of their fellow Comanche to come on the warpath. Estimates place the size of their total force at between 250 and 1,000 warriors, with most experts erring towards the lower end of those numbers. In either case, with their band of warriors now in tow, Isatai and Quanah had the force that they had long dreamed of. They consulted with chiefs from all of the tribes, and it was a near universal conclusion amongst them that the biggest single problem facing the tribes of the Southern Plains at the moment was that of the buffalo hunters. Their incessant slaughter of the lifeblood of the tribes must be stopped at any cost. And so, the war party, after much secretive preparation, now makes their way towards Adobe Walls, the headquarters of the buffalo trade in North Texas. Meanwhile, as the intertribal force of warriors make their final preparations for battle and then ride out towards Adobe Walls from across the plains, the buffalo hunters inside Hanrahan's sod-roof saloon are just finishing their laborious task of replacing the supposedly cracked ridgepole of the ramshackle building. They have been thoroughly plied with whiskey for their efforts, and many among them are ready to return to their bedrolls for some much-needed sleep. But Hanrahan, ever watchful of the eastern horizon as he awaits the sunrise, insists that they continue to stay and drink, free of charge, as a means of thanking them for their assistance. He intends to keep them awake until the impending attack finally comes, and hopes that their senses are not too dulled by alcohol to fight off their attackers. Finally, at around 4 a.m., the party of Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, led by Isatai and Quanah, arrive atop the ridgeline overlooking Adobe Walls. Isatai is completely naked and painted head to toe in yellow, the color of invincibility. Many of the warriors, as well as their horses, are also completely covered in yellow paint. 10 years earlier, in 1864, the legendary mountain man Kit Carson had led a U.S. Army contingent in search of Comanche raiders in a battle that had occurred in the Adobe ruins that gave the place its name, which lie about a mile away from where the buffalo hunters now make their homes. Carson and his men had seen a sight eerily similar to this, and it was only through Carson's inexorable leadership and coolness under fire that he and his men were able to survive. But the buffalo hunters here on this day in 1874 not only lack discipline and leadership, they are also largely half-drunk on rot-gut whiskey, and most have been kept up all night performing hard physical labor. They are, in short, in less than ideal condition to fight a pitched battle against a highly experienced and incredibly motivated attacking force. However, these hunters do have one thing that their countrymen serving in the U.S. Army a decade earlier did not: the Sharps buffalo rifle. The imposing firepower possessed by the weapon, combined with the experience and combative nature of the buffalo hunters, will now prove to be their only hope of survival in the fight to come. As the morning sun begins to crest the eastern horizon, the imposing force of native warriors, with the exception of Isatai and a few select elders, charges down the hill, sweeping down upon the small settlement with startling skill, speed, and ferocity. William Dixon, better known as Billy Dixon, a 23-year-old buffalo hunter who had come to Adobe Walls from Leavenworth, Kansas, by way of West Virginia, gives the following account of the initial morning charge. There was never a more splendidly barbaric sight. In after years, I was glad that I had seen it. Hundreds of warriors, the flower of the fighting men of the southwestern plains tribes, mounted upon their finest horses, armed with guns and lances and carrying heavy shields of thick buffalo hide, were coming like the wind. Over all was splashed the rich colors of red, vermilion, and ochre, on the bodies of the men and on the bodies of the running horses. Scalps dangled from their bridles, gorgeous war bonnets fluttered their plumes, bright feathers dangled from the tails and manes of the horses, and the bronzed, half-naked bodies of the riders glittered with ornaments of silver and brass. Behind this headlong charge stretched the plains, on whose horizon the rising sun was lifting its morning fires. The warriors seemed to emerge from this glowing background. The cry goes up amongst the buffalo hunters that an attack is fast approaching, and all those who are awake race to grab their weapons and barricade themselves inside of the adobe walled buildings. The walls are 2 feet thick, providing ample cover even from native rifle fire. However, outnumbered by at least 20 to 1, the buffalo hunters are well aware of their current predicament. They are also well aware of the vitriol the Plains tribes carry for them, and they know that the only thing worse than being killed would be to be captured alive by the Comanche and their allies. The tales of the unthinkable tortures wrought upon prisoners of war had circulated on the frontier for decades, and now those stories helped to steel the resolve of the buffalo hunters. But the attack happens in a flash, leaving 2 buffalo hunters, the Shadler brothers, who had been asleep in one of the covered wagons, stranded away from the cover of the adobe structures. They are quickly cut down, their pitiable cries drowned out in the din of gunfire and war cries. Their beloved dog, a large, sweet-natured Newfoundland, is also shot down in his efforts to defend his masters. All 3 are scalped. The attack roars on, and in a matter of moments it is within range of the adobe buildings. Another resident of adobe walls, a man named Billy Tyler, is shot through the lungs as he attempts to rush into one of the buildings in a futile dash for safety. The fight continues on, with the attacking tribesmen whirling in a cyclone of violence around the defenders who are now ensconced in the buildings, as they desperately fire out of the portholes cut into the walls. Quanah Parker, in the lead of the furious attack, attempts to batter down the door of Hanrahan's saloon by backing his horse up to the door and attempting to use the animal's powerful legs to kick it down. After a number of earnest attempts, though, the young warrior and fearless leader is forced to abandon his ploy in the midst of gunfire pouring out from the buffalo hunters inside. Now, the warriors attempt to set fire to the buildings, but the adobe walls and sod roofs make poor fuel for the flames, and the attackers are unable to accomplish much in the way of consequential damage. Finally, after suffering heavy initial losses at the hands of the buffalo hunters and their powerful rifles, a fate that they had been assured was impossible by the medicine man Isatai, the attacking native forces pulled back to regroup on the northern ridge. For the rest of the day, intermittent attacks rained down upon the besieged defenders. But time and again, the warriors are repelled, much to their confusion and consternation. Then, the attacks drag on into a second day. In between defending against charges, the defenders do their best to bury not only their dead, but veritable heaps of their own horses and oxen that the native warriors have killed in frustration when they are unable to breach the defenses of their human targets. However, more hope for the buffalo hunters comes in the way of reinforcements, when 2 more hunters come into the camp from the surrounding area. One of these men is sent out to ride to Dodge City for reinforcements, leaving the total number of the defending force at 30. Still, despite their disadvantages in mobility, numbers, and position, the buffalo hunters are able to stop the native forces from overrunning them. The attack continues on for a 3rd day, and a number of frustrated warriors, along with Isatai, congregate on a hill that later estimates gauge to be between 1,000 to 1,500 yards away from Hanrahan's saloon. The warriors and the medicine men sit atop their horses, presumably well outside of rifle range even for the powerful buffalo guns, and quarrel over what to do next, and over who is to blame for their difficulties so far. Isatai, doing his best to defend himself against his comrades' accusations of fraud and cowardice, claims that the Cheyenne had killed and eaten a skunk on the eve of their attack, effectively nullifying Isatai's medicine. As the group of tribesmen squabbles amongst themselves, Billy Dixon, the 23-year-old hunter who, despite his youth, has already built a considerable reputation for himself as a crack shot, eyes them from nearly a mile away while standing in the doorway of Hanrahan's saloon. After a few moments of sizing up the distance and condition, Dixon takes up his rifle and braces himself against the door jamb. "I was admittedly a good marksman," Dixon would later recall, yet this was a shot that one might call a scratch shot, meaning that, essentially, he simply aims as best he can and hopes for the most effective shot possible. Seconds after Dixon squeezes the trigger of his Sharps rifle, one of the native horsemen in the group berating Isatai suddenly slumps over and falls to the ground lifeless. Dixon's shot has, miraculously, struck one of the warriors from a distance thought by nearly everyone, including Dixon himself, to be impossible. The group on the hill scatters instantaneously, having incurred yet another fatality, and now with their nerves irreparably shaken. Still, throughout the day, more attacks are made, with Quanah Parker marveling many of the buffalo hunters with his strength and martial prowess, as he fearlessly charges again and again, and even manages to lift a wounded comrade off the ground with one hand while sitting atop his horse. Finally, Quanah's horse is shot out from under him at a distance of nearly 500 yards. He takes cover behind a hulking, rotting buffalo carcass, only to receive a bullet wound of his own between his neck and right shoulder blade. Ultimately, he is able to escape to safety, and while his wound will prove to be largely superficial, the damage that has been incurred by his forces is rapidly becoming unmanageable. The once prophetic Isatai now has no answers, and as dissension grows amongst the ranks of the Comanche, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, more buffalo hunters from the surrounding area pour into Adobe Walls to assist their buffalo hunter brethren. Several of the more experienced, older chiefs berate Isatai for causing such losses, beating him about the head and torso with their riding quirts. Though he can provide no solutions and still refuses to ride forth and fight the hunters himself, Isatai maintains his innocence. Soon, though, the native forces are rife with division and discouragement, and on the fourth day, they disappear into the expanse of the plains. After fighting for their lives for the better part of a week, the defenders holed up inside the buildings at Adobe Walls are elated. By August of that year, more than a month after the battle, a troop of cavalry arrived to Adobe Walls to find a dozen buffalo hunters still resolutely surviving in the remote outpost. Outside the saloon, each impaled on a post, are the skulls of several vanquished warriors. But the Americans' fight for expansion, and the tribe's fight for survival, will not end here. Though Isatai will go on to be held in great contempt by his people, Quanah Parker will become a seminal figure in the tribe's history, and a pivotal force in leading the Comanche forward in their new way of life into the 20th century. Billy Dixon, the hunter who made the nearly impossible shot at Adobe Walls, will go on to be awarded the Medal of Honor as a civilian for his actions in a fight against the Comanche and Kiowa only months after this battle at Adobe Walls. Also present at the fight is a young 20-year-old hunter and skinner named Bat Masterson, who will go on to become one of the Old West's most legendary figures, serving with the likes of Wyatt Earp, and even going on to work as a newspaper correspondent in his later years. The Second Battle of Adobe Walls will shape the lives of virtually all those who fought there and managed to, somehow, survive. It was also a pivotal moment in the history of the Old West, as it will, unofficially, mark the beginning of the end for the way of life of the tribes living on the plains. Never again would the buffalo range in such numbers, and never again would tribes like the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho roam with such freedom. The tribes present at Adobe Walls will all go on to carry out retributive raids on homesteads and farms from Mexico to Colorado, though never again would they hold martial superiority over their homelands. But the accounts of those many raids, as well as the many tales of the remarkable lives of figures such as Quanah Parker, Billy Dixon, and Bat Masterson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. San Antonio, Texas, March 6, 1836. As dawn breaks and the sound of cannon fire and gunshots fill the air, Davy Crockett and a contingent of defenders on the southwestern corner of the Alamo shoulder their rifles and unleash volley after volley into Mexican Army soldiers as they hurry to scramble up the steep wooden ladders that they have propped up against the mission walls. As Crockett reloads, men begin to fall to his left and to his right, and looking down from the top of the wall, he can see the hordes of Mexican soldiers scrambling to overtake this small mission. He and his men are vastly outnumbered, and they know that they are, in no uncertain terms, in a fight to the death. As the soldiers swarm up the ladders, cannonball after cannonball crashes into the thick adobe walls of the mission, rapidly bludgeoning a larger and larger hole for the attacking troops. Crockett, along with every one of his comrades who have spent the last few weeks defending this small former Spanish mission, has hardly slept. Many had labored into the night, fortifying weak points in their defenses by piling up stones and soil. Most have also spent the previous few hours restlessly turning under their blankets, hoping to find some rest before the coming battle. Most, however, had found little. And now, the fight is here. Soon, the shrieks of the wounded on both sides join the chorus of the horrific din of battle. Crockett now shoulders his rifle again and fires again, as do his comrades. But there is no time to mask their fire, and each man now simply does his best to fire and reload as quickly as possible. Soon, the first line of attackers begin to pour over the walls, being met by Crockett and his men, who now unleash a ferocious close-quarters attack with knives, pistols, and anything else that they can find. But the Mexican troops are themselves resigned to a vicious fight, and they wage a ferocious counterattack as what amounts to a life-or-death street fight takes place just inside the wall's parapet. Most of the men here are American citizens, who have moved to Texas in search of a better life, and who have decided to fight for Texas's right to secede from Mexico. However, contrary to popular belief, many of the defenders are, in fact, not Americans, but immigrants from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Denmark, as well as a number of native-born Mexicans who have sided with the Texian cause, who are known as Tejanos. But no man at the Alamo, be they American, Tejano, or Dutchman, is as well known as David "Davy" Crockett. Even at this point in 1836, Crockett is a national celebrity, known as both a legendary hunter and frontiersman, as well as a master storyteller and a sort of backwoods statesman. In the previous decade, he has met with presidents and foreign dignitaries, attended high society parties in New York and Washington, D.C., served in the halls of Congress, and even been the subject of a Broadway play. Now, it seems that his story will end here, in the hard, dusty ground of Texas. But, of course, this is not where his story began. Crockett's legend began in the hills of what was then considered the state of Franklin, what would eventually become the state of Tennessee, in Greene County in 1786. He was born to John and Rebecca Crockett, the fourth of 5 boys and the 7th of 9 children. He had grown up on the frontier, tracking, hunting, and fishing. He had also been turned out by his father as labor in order to pay off his father's debts. He had served in the War of 1812 under Andrew Jackson, working mostly as a scout and hunter, but gaining a reputation for his skill and endurance. He had married Polly Finley in 1806, with whom he had 3 children: John Wesley Crockett, born in 1807, William Finley Crockett, born in 1809, and Margaret Finley Crockett, born in 1814. Polly would pass away in 1815, likely from complications during childbirth or some related illness. Crockett would remarry quickly, as was common for widows and widowers alike, marrying Elizabeth Patton later in 1815. With Elizabeth, who herself had 3 children from a prior marriage, he would go on to have 3 more children: Robert, Rebecca, and Matilda Crockett. Soon after remarrying, Crockett would see the first advancements in his burgeoning political career, as a consequence of his ability to captivate an audience with his simplistic but enthralling storytelling style, regaling many eager listeners with tales of his wild life on the frontier. In 1817, he was elected Justice of the Peace of Lawrence County, then Lieutenant Colonel of the local militia, and finally as a state legislator to the Tennessee House in 1821. Throughout this time, Crockett, along with thousands of other Tennessee migrants, had moved his family further and further westward to the less populated areas of the territory. Here, on the fringes of the frontier, his popularity had grown amongst his constituents as a trustworthy, plain-spoken representative who could be counted on to act in their best interests. This reputation further spurred his political rise, seeing him elected to Congress in 1827. Here, he had famously broken ranks with his former commander, now President Andrew Jackson, vehemently opposing his Indian Removal Act of 1830. His opposition to the act had been so greatly appreciated by the Cherokee people that, in January of 1831, Cherokee Chief John Ross had sent Crockett a letter expressing his gratitude for the Tennesseans' steadfast support. But this stance had also been a driving force behind losing his bid for re-election, as opposing Jackson had cost him much support in his home state, largely populated by ardent Jackson supporters. In the 1831 election, he would lose to Jacksonian politician William Fitzgerald. This, however, would not end his political career, nor his celebrity. In 1831, The Lion of the West, a loosely biographical play starring the character Nimrod Wildfire as Crockett, had been a smash hit amongst New York audiences. Crockett had even attended a performance and been given a standing ovation after being pointed out to the audience. In 1833, he would regain his office, defeating Fitzgerald and returning to Congress, where he would serve until 1835. In 1835, however, he was again defeated in his bid for re-election by another Jacksonian politician named Adam Huntsman. Growing frustrated with the fickle nature of his constituency, Crockett, who had already been exchanging letters with friends in Texas, had finally, famously declared to his fellow Tennesseans that they may all go to hell. I am going to Texas. However, in 1835, Texas was a veritable tinderbox of political upheaval and an increasingly dangerous place for Anglo-American settlers seeking to stake their claim within the burgeoning republic. The Mexican government had, until now, actually permitted relatively unfettered settlement rights to Americans seeking to build homesteads in the areas that now comprise central Texas. This, in fact, was in large part seen as a preventative measure, one that provided a sort of human buffer between the larger settlements of northern Mexico and even Mexico City itself, from attack by the actual reigning power of Texas, the Comanche. But the laissez-faire nature of Mexican immigration laws had seen a radical reform in 1830 with the law of April 6, 1830, that severely restricted further Anglo incursion into the area. Special taxes and tariffs were also levied on the citizens living in Texas, further stoking their collective sense of injustice. This sense of frustration was, in fact, nothing new to the Texas frontier, as citizens of Mexico who already inhabited the area, known as Tejanos, had borne the burden of ferocious native attacks for decades, only to be largely seen as secondary concerns by their representatives in Mexico City. At the beginning of the 1830s, their sense of shared indignity had been ratcheted up even further by Mexican General San Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna's orders for Mexican troops to occupy towns in northern Mexico, including Anahuac, Velasco, and San Antonio, then known as Bejar. This had caused even more unrest amongst the local population and further solidified the shared interests and loyalties of the Anglo-Americans and Tejanos. However, one sizable point of contention between the two parties was the issue of slavery, which many of the Anglo settlers, especially those in the eastern reaches of Texas and those with roots in the Deep South, saw as an indispensable part of their culture. Though Mexico had officially abolished slavery in 1829, many of the settlers who already owned slaves failed to abide by the new policy. Many of the Tejanos were either reluctantly tolerant or tacitly disapproving of the abhorrent practice, which had never been a central aspect in their culture. Still, in the interest of gaining their independence from the Mexican government, which had failed them for so long, most of the Tejano population saw fit to overlook their disagreements. By October of 1835, tensions had erupted at the Battle of Gonzales, in which Mexican officials had demanded that the town of Gonzales surrender a pair of cannons that had been loaned to them for use in defense against the Comanche and other local tribes. The Texians, though, had refused, instead hiding the cannons until the morning of October 2nd, when they had filled them with scrap metal and met the Mexican army on the banks of the Guadalupe River under a flag that read, "Come and take it." They fired upon the Mexican soldiers, and after a brief skirmish, the Mexicans retreated, yielding the Texians an unlikely and morale-boosting victory. This skirmish effectively marked the beginning of the Texas Revolution. A week later, on October 9th, the Texans had moved to seize the Presidio La Bahia at Goliad in order to cut off the Mexican army's supplies to San Antonio. Attacking under cover of night, they had managed to seize control of the Presidio with one Texian wounded and one Mexican soldier killed. This gave the rebel Texans control over a vital strategic point and further boosted their confidence and enthusiasm, perhaps to the point of hubris. On October 28th, they had again won a decisive victory at the Battle of La Concepcion, and again in December at the siege of Bejar, in which they had wrested control of San Antonio from Santa Anna's army and took over the city for themselves. By this point, the vast majority of Texans sensed that the victory they sought was well within reach, if not already outright assured. They took control of the old mission, known as the Alamo, and began to fortify it for use as a defensive position when Santa Anna inevitably returned with his army for one last effort to hold on to the crucially important city. For many among the roughly 200 Texans now firmly in control of San Antonio, this was an opportunity that they looked forward to, as they believed that they would not only defeat the much-hated general, but force him to surrender. By the time Davy Crockett and a band of his close friends had begun to make their way to Texas, all among them believed that they were on their way to be part of a great victory. Their main concern was simply that they might miss out on the fighting. By the time Crockett and company arrived at the Alamo, command of the Texian forces had changed hands a number of times. Original Commander Edward Burleson, who would go on to carve his own legendary reputation in Texas history, had resigned, and Francis Johnson had taken his place. Johnson had proven to be unpopular and lost confidence amongst his men after an ill-advised expeditionary trip into Mexico had left the men in San Antonio hard-pressed for ammunition and supplies for a number of weeks. James Clinton Neal had replaced Johnson in January of 1836, but had been forced to resign his position and return home after receiving word that members of his family had become critically ill. In his stead, joint command of the city and of the Alamo had fallen to two men. One was a 26-year-old Alabama lawyer who had fled severe debt in his homeland, leaving his wife and two young children, and moved to Mexican-held Texas. He had quickly become politically involved, gaining local renown as a firebrand revolutionary and immovable supporter of Texas's independence. His name was Colonel William B. Travis. The other was a 42-year-old frontiersman, entrepreneur, and real estate speculator of questionable repute. He was, in fact, a celebrity himself, though of a more regional nature than Crockett. He had gained his renown after a knife fight on a small island on the Mississippi River in 1827, in which he had used a massive knife given to him by his brother to eviscerate his opponent in a brawl over a duel. Though he had been wounded several times himself, his name had both risen to that of a frontier legend and given birth to one of the Old West's most famous weapons. In the preceding months, he had also, tragically, become stricken with a deadly illness, most likely typhoid pneumonia. Despite all of his repute, it was evident to himself and to all who saw him that he was a man quickly succumbing to his ailments. His name was Jim Bowie. When Davy Crockett and his contingent of roughly 30 volunteers arrived at the Alamo on February 8th of 1836, he was met and warmly welcomed by Bowie and Travis. It had seemed to all three of the men that victory for Texas was surely at hand. But over the following 2 weeks, the situation had rapidly deteriorated. Even as Crockett had been making his way south to Texas, General Santa Anna, fuming at having been forced to cede control of San Antonio to the Texians, was already on a march north from Mexico City with thousands of troops. A polarizing figure in his home country, Santa Anna believes that his tenuous hold on his power in Mexico cannot withstand the shame of a defeat against the ragtag militias of Texas. With this in mind, he had pushed his army to return to San Antonio as quickly as possible in order to retake the city and beat the Texians into submission. On February 23rd, only 2 weeks after Crockett's arrival, sentries inside the Alamo had spotted Mexican cavalry in the hills near San Antonio. This stunned the Texians within the city, as none could believe that Santa Anna and his troops had been able to make their return so quickly. Now, roughly 1,500 to 1,800 Mexican troops surrounded their force of roughly 180 men. For Crockett, Bowie, Travis, and the rest of the defenders at the Alamo, it had been made immediately clear that the fight had been brought to their doorstep, and that they would have to make their stand much sooner than they had anticipated. Travis and Bowie had ordered every Texan in San Antonio to immediately make their way to the Alamo, their only refuge within the entire city. The rebels had been caught off guard, and Santa Anna knew it. The Mexican army had quickly taken control of the city and surrounded the Alamo, trapping the defenders within its walls. For their parts, the Texians, several of them with their wives and children, were now cut off from escape and in dire need of reinforcements. For 13 torturous days, The Mexican army had laid siege to the Alamo, incessantly pounding the main adobe-walled building with artillery and destroying the wooden walls that encompassed the compound. Throughout the siege, Santa Anna had sent several envoys to negotiate for the Texians' surrender, but all had been soundly refused by the defenders. On February 24th, the second day of the siege, Colonel Travis had written a letter, sent out by way of Captain Albert Martin, who volunteered for the incredibly dangerous task of skulking out of the city at night and delivering the letter 75 miles east to his hometown of Gonzales, Texas. The letter, pleading for help from his leadership but resolved to fight to the end, read as follows: "I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna, and I shall never surrender or retreat. Then I call on you, in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and of everything dear to the American character, to come to our aid. Victory or death." Though Captain Martin and 31 other intrepid men from Gonzales would actually make their way into the Alamo in an effort to provide reinforcements, their number was but a fraction of that Travis had hoped for. On the same day that Travis had sent his letter, General Santa Anna had ordered the black flag of no quarter raised above his headquarters, signaling to the Texians that none of them would be spared should they fail to surrender. While Travis may or may not have drawn a line in the sand with his sword and asked all of those willing to give their lives to step over the line in a symbol of their resolve, it was quite clear to Crockett and all of his fellow defenders that all of those who did not surrender to the Mexican army would pay with their lives. But save for Lewis Rose, the one man who chose to escape with his life, the men inside the Alamo all chose to remain and pay the ultimate price. Now, after laying siege to the Alamo compound for 2 weeks, Santa Anna has ordered the attack that is now flooding inside the walls of the former mission. Within minutes, Colonel Travis, defending the north side of the compound, is shot dead with a musket ball through the forehead. Meanwhile, Jim Bowie lies inside a small room, bedridden and so stricken by his illness that the famous frontier fighter is unable to even stand, much less present any kind of resistance. As the battle rages outside, Mexican soldiers barge into the room where Bowie lies and quickly put an end to his storied life with their bayonets. Meanwhile, Crockett, one of the few remaining combatants towards the latter stages of the fight, continues to pour fire into the attacking soldiers until he is run entirely out of ammunition. At this point, he and his fellow defenders use their rifles as clubs and slash and stab with their large hunting knives, using anything at their disposal to fight to the bitter end, as all among them know that these are their last moments. Crockett, as well, will meet his end on this bloody morning. However, it is not entirely clear exactly how he was killed. Some accounts hold that Crockett was shot and killed in the latter stages of the battle, while others say he and a small number of defenders who were left alive were actually taken prisoner and summarily executed under the watchful eye of General Santa Anna. While his exact cause of death is unknown, the ultimate fate of the Alamo defenders will be the same for all of them. The bodies of the dead men, who had only hours earlier stirred inside the compound walls, are laboriously stacked into piles by the Mexican troops and then lit on fire, denying them all both funerals and proper graves. But while the Battle of the Alamo had ended in a resounding defeat for the Texians, their resolve and willingness to give their all would soon give birth to a renewed fury amongst their countrymen. While General Santa Anna had expected that his victory would result in breaking the will of the Texians, he would soon be horrified when it in fact produced the opposite result. Instead of inducing surrender, the example of the Alamo defenders would soon renew the fury of the rebels, resulting in several key defeats for the Mexican army, all while cries of "Remember the Alamo" resounded about the battlefield. With his ultimate defeat at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, Santa Anna would be forced into surrender, and Texas would gain its ultimate independence from Mexico. But without the sacrifice of the men at the Alamo, this victory may very well have never have occurred. Though certainly imperfect men, the names of Bowie, Travis, and, perhaps more than any, Davy Crockett will forever be remembered as examples of full devotion to a cause, even at the cost of one's own life. In modernity, Crockett has gone on to become known in American culture as a sort of pop culture figure, one who was born on a mountaintop in Tennessee and killed himself a bar when he was only 3. But the truth behind the man is, arguably, far more unbelievable and far more consequential than even contemporary lore has given him credit for. But the many stories of the frontier exploits of Davy Crockett, from the hunting of the Tennessee woods to his service in the Creek War, as well as the countless other instances that have been overlooked by mainstream history outlets, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southeastern Arizona, July 15, 1862. As the summer sun reaches its noontime apex, a group of 140 U.S. Army soldiers straggle through a narrow pass in search of a freshwater spring known to be in the area. All of them know that this is a very dangerous place to be, as the Apache, the most feared and powerful tribe in this area, have been known to ambush their enemies in just such a place as this. But the heat is brutal, and these men and their horses are thirsty. If they do not drink soon, they may very well perish. So they continue on, with every sound that echoes off the steep walls of the pass, causing many troopers to flinch nervously, as their eyes continually sweep the hillsides around them. But so far, there has been no sign of the Apache, and the soldiers are almost to the springs. All among them can nearly taste its cold, clear waters finally slaking their thirst. Then, suddenly, the landscape around them explodes in gunfire and war cries. It is the Chiricahua Apache, led by Chief Mangus Coloradus and his son-in-law, Cochise. They have painstakingly planned this ambush, and now it seems that it will result in a great victory against these soldiers, whom the Apache refer to as White Eyes. From the vantage point of the Apaches in the hills surrounding the pass, the soldiers appear like a scattering group of prey animals. From the soldiers' vantage point, the Apaches are seemingly everywhere, hundreds of them, and now the soldiers are trapped. The Apache are not only atop the hills to their left and to their right, but they have blocked the soldiers' route to the springs. Their commanding officer, Captain Thomas Roberts, knows that many of his men are already on the verge of dying of thirst, and that a retreat back across the parched desert will likely kill many of them. Thus, his order goes out. The men will stay and fight. But the arrows and bullets raining down upon them soon prove to be too much for them to hold their position, and Roberts orders the men to move back towards the entrance of the pass. With every passing minute, it seems more and more likely to Mangus Coloradus and Cochise that their plan has in fact worked. Mangus Coloradus, or Red Sleeves, was given his name by another long-time Apache enemy, the Mexicans. Born in 1795, he had risen to this position via hard combat and steadfast leadership. Standing roughly 6'6", Mangus is much taller than his contemporaries and has risen to prominence via his fearsome, fearless conduct in the ongoing wars the Apache fought with the Americans, the Mexicans, the Spanish, and rival tribes such as the Navajo and the Comanche. In 1837, his predecessor had been murdered by Mexican bandits and scalped in order to reap the bounty the Mexican government had offered for Apache scalps. Mangus's first order of business as a newly appointed chief was to wreak absolute havoc upon the perpetrators of the murder, raiding Mexican settlements and farms throughout the territories of what was then northern Mexico. He had joined with another Apache chief named Cuchillo Negro, or Black Knife, in order to effectively hold the entire town of Santa Rita hostage after some of their silver miner citizenry had killed a number of Apache. The Apache's disdain for the Mexican government ran so deep that in 1846, during the Mexican-American War, the Apache promised American troops safe passage on their way south to battle Santa Anna's army. In the 1850s, tensions had continued to rise between the Americans and the Apache, culminating in smaller-scale engagements like the 1854 Battle of Ojo Caliente, in which the army had engaged a band of roughly 150 Apache warriors, killing 5 and wounding 6. But still, Mangus, now around 70 years old, had sought to let prudence be the better part of valor, and had argued and worked for some kind of agreeable peace with the Americans. Though still a revered and fearsome war chief, he had seen enough death and suffering in his time to seek to avoid it whenever possible. But in December of 1860, a group of 30 miners had attacked a small Apache camp, killing 4 warriors, wounding several others, and taking 13 women and children prisoner. This would prove to be the final straw for Mangus Coloradus, and the imposing chief would, from then on, conduct his raiding upon the Americans with as much voracity as he had against the Mexicans. In 1860, one of Mangus's daughters, Dos Tese, married a promising young warrior who had managed to garner the approval of her legendary father. This warrior was Cochise. In early 1861, Cochise and a band of young warriors had been falsely accused by a local army official of kidnapping a 12-year-old boy. The boy had, in fact, been taken by another group of Apaches belonging to the Cayotero band, but the prevailing sentiment amongst the officers was that Cochise and his men were guilty, if not of this particular crime, then certainly of some other. In their efforts to arrest him, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had ordered Lieutenant George Bascom to take his men into the Chiricahua Mountains and to kill or capture any Apache they could find, by any means necessary. But, realizing that it would be next to impossible to hunt the Apache down in their own territory, Bascom had instead resorted to inviting Cochise and his followers to a supposedly peaceful meeting. Cochise, living far away from both the ranch where the attack had occurred and from the homelands of the Cayotero Apache, had no knowledge that the attack had even occurred, and was under the impression that this was to be a meeting to speak about coming to peace with the U.S. government. In fact, he had felt so assured of his safety that he had come to the meeting with his brother, 2 of his nephews, his wife, and 2 children. This would prove to be a dire mistake. Under a flag of truce, Bascom would invite Cochise into his tent, under the auspices that they would discuss the possibility for peace between their 2 peoples. But once they were inside the tent, Bascom immediately began to accuse Cochise of kidnapping the young boy. Cochise, having no knowledge that the attack had even occurred, vehemently denied any involvement in the incident. But Bascom did not believe him. And, in short order, 2 guards moved to arrest and detain Cochise. In response to this, the Apache warrior quickly pulled his knife and slashed open the back wall of the tent, diving through the hole and running in a zigzag pattern to avoid the soldiers' gunfire before escaping into the hills. But while Cochise had evaded arrest, Bascom still had custody of his brother, his nephews, and his wife and 2 children. In retaliation, Cochise had quickly organized a series of raids and taken hostages of his own. He had hoped to use these hostages to bargain for the release of his family, but although his wife and children would later be released, Bascom would refuse to negotiate for the release of Cochise's brother and nephews, all of whom would eventually be executed by hanging. In retaliation for this, several of Cochise's captives were killed as well, reportedly via torturous ends, being stabbed or roasted alive. These events, known to history as the Bascom Affair, would cause a complete breakdown in relations between the U.S. and the Apache. Throughout the spring of 1862, Cochise, Mangus Coloradus, and their warriors had raided the surrounding countryside relentlessly. Countless homesteads were destroyed, and countless numbers of settlers in remote areas met horrific ends at the hands of the Apache. But as the raiding intensified, the U.S. Army was less and less capable of pursuing and engaging the Apache. This was due to the ongoing American Civil War, which now engulfed the attention of the entire nation. While much of the fighting was taking place east of the Mississippi, the war did in fact spill all the way into the American Southwest. In fact, it is the entire reason that these U.S. Army troops have come to Apache Pass in the first place. They are on a march eastward, intent on driving Confederate forces out of the territory. In fact, just prior to beginning their march towards Apache Pass, they had driven Confederate forces from the city of Tucson without a shot being fired. But in their pursuit of the Confederates, U.S. Army officers had sought out these springs at Apache Pass as a waypoint at which to slake their men's thirst and to provide a respite from their incessant, exhaustive desert march. These soldiers, comprised of 116 troops from the 1st California Infantry and 22 cavalrymen from the 2nd California Cavalry, have already marched hundreds of miles, with hundreds more to go. They are, in fact, a scouting party sent out in advance of the main force in order to reconnoiter the location and determine the suitability of the watering hole for a force of nearly 2,000 men who have remained behind at nearby Dragoon Springs. Now, they find themselves fighting against an Apache force that outnumbers them nearly 2 to 1, and also occupies the high ground all around them. But for all that the soldiers lack in numbers and tactical position, their one hope lies in their superior firepower. In addition to their infantry and cavalrymen, they have also brought with them 2 mountain howitzer field cannons. These cannons, carried in segments on the backs of 3 to 4 mules, could rapidly be assembled and brought to bear against enemy forces. Though not as large as traditional field cannons, they are far more mobile and adaptable to quick use in battle. Now, with the center of Apache Pass appearing more and more like a certain death trap, Captain Roberts orders his men to retreat to the mouth of the pass and make ready the howitzers. With bullets and arrows raining down all around them, the artillery crew hurriedly works to assemble and load the artillery weapons, as their comrades in arms provide covering fire against the Apache warriors that they are scarcely able to see. Finally, though, the howitzers are loaded, and Roberts orders the first volley against the Apache to be unleashed. With a cacophonous roar, the howitzers fire. But with the Apaches ensconced high up on the hillsides surrounding them, this first attempt proves to be futile, as the angle is too steep for the howitzers to reach their targets. The first 2 12-pound cannonballs simply slam into the ground well below the Apache. But the troops, knowing that these howitzers are now their only hope of getting out of Apache Pass alive, hurriedly reposition the cannons, moving them even farther back towards the entrance of the pass. Moments later, another roar rings out from the howitzers, and this time, 2 Apache positions are hit directly. For the Apache, this is the first time they have seen the howitzers in use. While they have seen the use of field artillery by the Spanish and the Mexicans in the preceding decades, artillery of this power and mobility is something altogether new and undoubtedly unsettling. But these warriors, fighting under the revered leadership of both Mangus Coloradus and Cochise, and intent on exacting their revenge upon the Americans, refused to retreat from their positions. And so, for the remainder of the afternoon and nearly until the sun has fully set, the fighting continues, with the Army soldiers pouring artillery fire into the Apache ranks, and the Apache moving from position to position behind the rocks and crags of the hills, taking shots at the soldiers whenever an opportunity arose. Finally, though, as darkness falls over the desert, the Apache disappear into the landscape, leaving the exhausted, thirsty, and hungry soldiers to finally have access to the waters of Apache Springs. As the moon rises, Captain Roberts cautiously allows his men to advance to the spring, and finally, when it seems as though the Apache have indeed retired from the fight, he allows his men to drink from the springs and to enjoy a meal in the cool of the night. The next morning, before Captain Roberts and his men are able to move out and head back to the main contingent of Army soldiers at Dragoon Springs, Mangus Coloradus, Cochise, and their Apache warriors again line the hillsides surrounding the pass. But this time, loath to endure another prolonged and costly fight, they soon meld into the rocks and hillsides again, retiring from the fight for good and returning to their camp to reorganize and refit for another chance at the Americans. Captain Roberts and his men will reach Dragoon Springs later this evening and report their narrow escape to their unnerved comrades, who now realize that the ongoing Civil War is no longer the only conflict they will have to worry about. In the end, 2 American soldiers would be killed and 2 wounded, as well as roughly 10 Apache killed and an unknown number wounded. This battle, what will come to be known to history as the Battle of Apache Pass, marks a true escalation in the war between the U.S. Army and the Apache people, one that will carry on for decades to come. This war will result in some of the most brutal fighting in American history, with countless lives lost on both sides. For their parts, Mangus Coloradus and Cochise will pass into legend as 2 of the most important leaders in the history of the Apache tribe. However, neither of their roads will be easy. In 1863, Mangus will be killed by American soldiers in a horrific incident marred by deception, cruelty, and an unnerving fascination with the macabre. For his part, Cochise will go on to fight the Army for another decade, before ultimately retiring to the short-lived Chiricahua Reservation in Arizona, where he died of natural causes in 1874. But the countless legendary exploits of both Mangus Coloradus and Cochise, as well as the countless battles fought in the decades-long war between the U.S. Army and the Apache, are far too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Northern Texas, September 12, 1874. As a cyclone of more than 100 Kiowa and Comanche warriors encircles them, unleashing a hail of bullets and arrows, a small group of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers are caught in the open prairie, fighting for their lives. All of them have incurred varying degrees of battle wounds thus far, with some in critical condition. They are a 6-man detachment of 4 enlisted men, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath, Harrington, and Smith, as well as 2 Army scouts, Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon. Dixon is already a legend on the frontier, having made a name for himself only months earlier at the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, where his ability to shoot down a Comanche chief from nearly a half a mile away had turned the tide of the battle and likely saved the lives of all of his comrades. Now, it seems that Dixon and his cohorts will find no such luck on this day, as the open prairie offers them nothing in the way of cover or concealment. This detail of men has been dispatched by Colonel Nelson A. Miles to carry dispatches concerning the delay of supplies being brought to his camp by Captain Willis Lyman's supply train. This delay had itself been the result of Kiowa and Comanche warriors stalling its progress with incessant raiding and attacks. Now, a smaller contingent of Kiowa and Comanche have diverted their forces to concentrate on the errant scouting detail. These attacks are not random occurrences. They are part of the ongoing Red River War, which will ultimately be the beginning of the end of the decades-long conflict between the tribes of the Southern Plains and the United States government. The Kiowa and Comanche have long been the dominant tribes here in the north of Texas, and are intent on fighting to the bitter end for their lands. The violence that has unfolded in the preceding decade and a half has been among the worst the already bloody history of Texas has ever seen. Countless innocents on both sides have perished. Countless combatants have lost their lives in brutal, bloody engagements, and untold amounts of lands and goods have been lost. It is well known amongst all soldiers and scouts that being caught in the open by the Kiowa and Comanche would be among the worst of all possible scenarios on the Texas plains. These warriors, though having relatively little in the way of formal hierarchy and militaristic structure, are perhaps the best light cavalry on the planet at this time. They are capable of feats of horsemanship largely only seen in present-day trick-riding exhibitions, all while being able to fire several arrows a minute. Their tactics, well known but incredibly difficult to combat, are to bear down upon their adversaries in whirling cyclonic attacks, before eventually dispersing in scattered groups across the plains at the conclusion of the fight. For a United States Army whose last major conflict was the American Civil War, the difference between the more stratified, organized warfare of that conflict and defending and attacking against these highly mobile groups of guerrilla fighters is a stark, startling contrast. Billy Dixon is one of the most experienced scouts in the Army in this style of warfare, but even to him, this present fight seems to be in sheer futility, as he and his cohorts are easy targets for their adversaries. As soon as the attack commenced, every one of the men had known it would be only a matter of time until one of them was struck down by the Kiowa and Comanche fire. The first unfortunate soldier to fall would be Private George Smith, the man put in charge of holding the horses so as to keep them from stampeding away during the fight. Private Smith is hit only minutes into the fight with a bullet passing through one of his lungs, sending the man crumbling to the ground and setting the horses loose. The horses are still fully loaded with the men's haversacks, coats, blankets, and water canteens. In only a few moments, the soldiers have lost not only one of their own, but their supplies and transportation as well. The only option now would be to fight to the last man. The Kiowa and Comanche, however, seeing their enemies to now be easy targets, are in no rush to risk losing any of their own men with needlessly risky attacks. Therefore, they now engage in intermittent small attacks, with each warrior in these smaller groups seeking to win glory for their deeds of bravery and gallantry, measured by how close they are able to attack and how much damage they are able to inflict. The majority of their ire is directed away from the group of 5 soldiers and concentrated on the seemingly lifeless body of George Smith. The unfortunate Smith had been first assumed to be dead by his comrades, and they made great efforts to stop the attacking warriors from capturing his body. But Smith is, in fact, still alive and in great agony, but unable to do anything to assist himself. As the waves of attack press nearer and nearer to him, he can only lie prostrate and motionless as his friends attempt to defend him. Finally, though, the fight becomes too intense for any of the remaining men to hold their current exposed positions. Dixon spots a small mesquite flat over a quarter-mile away and suggests that the men make a run for its relative cover. But just before they can make their move, Dixon's fellow Army scout, Amos Chapman, is struck by a bullet. He matter-of-factly alerts his comrade, "Billy, I am hit at last." Though Dixon is looking at Chapman when he is shot, he is not able to ascertain the severity of the wound to his comrade while keeping up the fight himself. However, during his next lookout onto the prairie to fire upon the charging warriors, Dixon spots a closer option for cover, a shallow depression in the plains not far from their current position. The depression, known as a buffalo wallow, is the result of the buffalo herds who still frequent the area, pawing and wallowing in the prairie dirt. Though it is not ideal, it would certainly be an improvement from their current circumstances. So, Dixon shouts to his comrades that he will make a break for the buffalo wallow in an attempt to see close up whether or not it will provide a suitable place for them to make a defensive stand. He then makes a mad dash amongst withering Kiowa and Comanche fire to the wallow, which measures roughly 10 feet by 10 feet. Dixon determines that the shallow depression will provide enough cover and yells for the remainder of his able-bodied comrades to follow his lead. This they do, and within minutes the men are busy digging with their hands and bowie knives, piling up the soft sand to the edges of the wallow in between defending against the charges of the native warriors. The Kiowa and Comanche now, for their part, intensify their attacks on the buffalo wallow, seeing a more immediate need to finish off their quarry. As the day drags into the afternoon, the psyches of some of the men caught in this desperate plight in the middle of the buffalo wallow begin to fray. The following is Billy Dixon's first-hand account of one of his comrades reaching their perceived psychological limits during the vicious engagement. Many times that terrible day did I think that my last moment was at hand. Once, when the Indians were crowding us awfully hard, one of the boys raised up and yelled, "No use, boys, no use. We might as well give it up." We answered by shouting him to lie down. At that moment, a bullet struck the soft sand near him and completely filled his mouth with dirt. I was so amused that I laughed, though in a rather sickly way, for none of us felt much like laughing. In a lull in the fighting, one of the men shouts to Amos Chapman, still alive but badly wounded, telling him to make his way over to the buffalo wallow. Chapman shouts back that the bullet that struck him has broken his leg, and he is unable to walk. Dixon decides that he, as the most able-bodied man available, having suffered only a slight wound to his right calf, will make an attempt to save his friend and fellow scout. Returning to Dixon's account, I made several efforts to reach him before I succeeded. Every time the Indians saw me start, they would fire such a volley that I was forced to retreat, until I finally made a run and got to Chapman. I told him to climb on my back, my plan being to carry him as I would a little child. Drawing both his legs in front of me and laying the broken one over the sound one to support it, I carried him to the wallow, though not without difficulty, as he was a larger man than myself, and his body a dead weight. It taxed my strength to carry him. Now, all of the men, in their various states of injury and agony, began to silently, deliberately, dig and scoop more of the silted earth up into the short wall around the edge of the wallow. Despite their composure, the dire nature of their situation only intensifies, as the attacks increase in frequency and ferocity before one of the chiefs is shot down. Dixon's account continues. When I look back and recall our situation, I always find myself thinking of how my wounded companions never complained or faltered, but fought as bravely as if a bullet had not touched them. Sometimes the Indians would ride towards us at headlong speed with lances lifted and poised, undoubtedly bent on spearing us. Such moments made a man brace himself and grip his gun. Fortunately, we were able to keep our heads and bring down or disable the leader. Such charges proved highly dangerous to the Indians, and gradually grew less frequent. For much of the afternoon, as the hot sun beats down upon them, the men on both sides fight on. The warriors continue their assaults on the buffalo wallow, while the ammunition of the scouts and soldiers begins to dwindle. The thoughts of every man within the buffalo wallow, at some point or another during the long afternoon, drift to the horrifying possibility of the worst possible outcome in this situation, being captured alive. Dixon recalls, "Ours was the courage of despair. We knew what would befall us if we should be captured alive. We had seen too many naked and mangled bodies of white men who had been spread-eagled and tortured with steel and fire to forget what our own fate would be, so we were determined to fight to the end." Then, just when it seems things cannot possibly become more desperate, the North Texas weather undertakes one of its notorious sudden changes, as storm clouds seem to fill the sky out of nowhere. At around 3 o'clock, a torrential downpour manages not only to soak the exposed men and their equipment, but to fill the bottom of the buffalo wallow with roughly 2 inches of muddy brown water, which mixes with the blood and gore of the wounded men, creating a nightmarish miasma. But the storm also serves to forestall the attacks of the Kiowa and Comanche. They now sit stoically upon their horses, wrapped snugly in blankets, just out of rifle range, waiting for the storm to pass. Meanwhile, the men in the buffalo wallow have only their thin linen shirts and military boots and pants to ward off the sudden cold. Any of the supplies they may have had are now gone with their horses, along with Dixon's coat, which contains his one and only picture of his mother, given to him by his dying father. But, despite the lull in attacks, and in spite of the relentless cold and wet of the storm, the solemn business of surviving the fight at hand still has to be dealt with. With ammunition running low, the men suggest that one of them retrieve the weapon and cartridge belt of the fallen Private George Smith. Private Peter Rath volunteers to undertake this dangerous endeavor. Rath dashes to Private Smith's location, only to discover, to his horror, that Smith is in fact alive and has been left prostrate, bleeding, and suffering for the entirety of the battle. Rath runs back to the buffalo wallow, and informs Dixon and the others that Smith is still alive but too injured to move. Dixon and Rath then make their way back to Smith, where upon further examination, Dixon finds the wound to be all but certainly fatal. Still, they manage to get Smith up and back to the buffalo wallow. Here, as the sky blackens and night falls, the Kiowa and Comanche disappear over the rolling hills of the plains. Smith suffers his final hours in great agony, often begging his comrades to end his suffering. At roughly 11 p.m., his body is found to have gone cold in death. Now, the men are left with the fatal proposition of either going to find help or staying to meet the native warriors the next day. First, Private Rath again volunteers to go out into the night in search of the trail that will lead them to the nearby Camp Supply. 2 hours later, he returns, disappointedly reporting that he has failed to find the trail. Now, it will be up to Dixon to wait until the first signs of daylight and venture out to find their lifeline to safety. His account of the events continues. Like everything else, the long night finally came to an end, and the sun rose clear and warm the next morning. By this time, all of the men were willing that I should go for help, and I at once started. Daylight exposed me to many dangers from which the night shielded me. By moving cautiously at night, it was possible to avoid the enemy, but if surprised, to stand a good chance of escape. In the daytime, however, the enemy could lie in hiding and scan the country in every direction. On the plains, especially in the fall when the grass is brown, the smallest moving object may be perceived by the trained eye at an astonishingly long distance. I knew that I must proceed with utmost caution, lest I fall into an ambush or be attacked in the open by superior numbers. I had traveled scarcely more than half a mile when I struck the plain trail leading to Camp Supply. Hurrying along as rapidly as possible and keeping a constant lookout for Indians, I checked myself into the sudden sight of an outfit that seemed to cover about an acre of ground 2 miles or so to the northwest. The outfit at first did not appear to be moving, and I could not tell whether it was made up of white men or natives. I skulked to a growth of tall grass and hid for a while. My nerves were too keen to endure hiding and waiting, so I stole back and took another look. The outfit was moving towards me. Shortly, I was able to see that they were troops. I have never felt happier in my life. I wanged loose with my old .50 to attract the attention of the soldiers and saw the whole command come to a halt. I fired my gun a second time, which brought 2 soldiers to me. I told them of our condition, and they rode rapidly back to their command and reported. Dixon now accompanies the soldiers back to the buffalo wallow, but the passing troops offer only some hardtack and water to the injured men, as their surgeons perform only cursory examinations of their wounds before the troop moves on, promising reinforcements will soon come. Meanwhile, the survivors of what history will come to know as the Buffalo Wallow Fight bury the body of Private George Smith at the bottom of the wallow they had fought for their lives from. It will be 2 more days of waiting next to a nearby creek before the men would hear the welcome sound of the cavalry coming their way. They will go on to be taken back to Camp Supply and cared for. Amos Chapman's leg will be amputated above the knee, but, in Dixon's recollection, Amos was as tough as second-growth hickory, and was soon out of the hospital and in the saddle. All of the survivors would go on to continue their careers with the Army, as well as stay in touch via letters sent amongst each other for years to come. With a pang of notable regret, Dixon recounts in the last line of the chapter in his memoir concerning the events, "It was always my intention to go back and mark the spot where the Buffalo Wallow Fight took place, and where George Smith still lies buried. Procrastination and the remoteness of the spot have prevented my going." Still, all of the survivors of the Buffalo Wallow Fight, Sergeant Woodhull and Privates Rath and Harrington, as well as the scouts Amos Chapman and Billy Dixon, were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Private George Smith, who had perished in the midst of the battle, was as well posthumously awarded the medal, the nation's highest honor for military valor in combat. The medals were presented by Colonel Nelson A. Miles, himself a recipient of the award. For their part, the Kiowa and Comanche, as well as their counterparts in the Cheyenne and Southern Arapaho, will continue to combat the United States government in a desperate bid to maintain their homelands and way of life. Their conflict will carry on for another 9 months, finally ending in June of 1875, when Quanah Parker and his band of Quahati Comanche reported to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. The Red River War will go down in the annals of Old West history as one of the most consequential conflicts ever waged on the North American continent. But the many tales of the dangerous, bloody exploits of Billy Dixon and the Army Scouts, as well as the bravery and ruthlessness of the tribes of the Southern Plains during the Red River War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southeastern Idaho, January 29, 1863. As the early morning sun peeks over the mountaintops, Chief Sagwitch of the Shoshone tribe shakes off the cold of the night and takes in the tranquil beauty of the dawn landscape around him. His people have come here, as they have for generations, to hunker down in their lodges to endure another freezing Utah winter. He is proud to be Shoshone and grateful for the lands of his people, but suddenly the chief spots a curious sight on the horizon, a cloud of fog slowly rising over the hilltops. At first, he believes this to be simply the morning frost evaporating under the new day's sun. But after watching for several minutes, he notices that the cloud has moved, and it is approaching the site of his village. This, he is certain, likely signals only one thing: the approach of a large group of men and horses, moving straight towards he and his people's winter sanctuary. Now, he sends up a cry of alarm, rousing his warriors and calling a meeting in his lodge. The men, knowing time is scarce, hurriedly discuss their next moves. They all know the likely cause of the soldiers' impending arrival. In the few years prior, their interaction with the U.S. Army has been relatively limited, as the majority of American fighting men are engaged in the Civil War, taking place mostly east of the Mississippi River. But on January 5, 1863, only a few weeks prior to this morning, a group of 10 miners, traveling west on the Montana Trail, had been murdered, allegedly by a group of Shoshone raiders. On January 6th, another group of miners headed south to Salt Lake City had been accosted and robbed, again, allegedly, by a group of unidentified Shoshone warriors. That same day, in an argument with another group of more unidentified natives, a local Idaho rancher named John H. Smith was shot down by the natives whom he accused of stealing his cattle. A Salt Lake City judge had issued a warrant for the arrest of the Shoshone warriors alleged to have been involved. Orders for enforcing the warrant had fallen to U.S. Army Colonel Patrick E. Connor. Connor is a commander of roughly 300 infantrymen and cavalry from the 3rd Regiment California Volunteer Infantry, who are stationed in Salt Lake City during the Civil War. His men are largely frustrated regulars who are in large part resentful of their post on the frontier, one that all but nullifies their chances of battlefield glory during their nation's greatest conflict. But, charged with this less than desirable duty, they had begun their march northward, set on apprehending the guilty Shoshone, or, for that matter, any Shoshone. Knowing that retributive actions were soon coming their way, roughly 50 Shoshone warriors had fled Sagwitch's village only a few days prior, but most had seen fit to stay with their trusted chief. Now, surrounded by his warriors in his lodge, he advises them to proceed with caution in their interactions with the approaching soldiers. Bloodshed, he reminds them, is not a foregone conclusion, and their primary concern must be the safety of their village and their families. He is also well aware that the Shoshone do not possess the firepower to compete with any U.S. Army detachment. Most of the warriors have in their possession rifles that have been captured in battles, garnered in trade, or are what amounts to antiques, passed down through several generations. But they are not wholly defenseless. They have selected a location for their village that is only accessible through one path leading in and out. They have also erected fences of woven willow branches in order to obscure an outsider's view into the village, and they have dug firing pits behind the fence. And, although the Shoshone do not know it, the soldiers now approaching their village, though armed with superior weapons and training, are themselves in a highly compromised position from both the length of their journey and the elements. In the previous few days, as they traveled north through Cache Valley, the weather had been unseasonably cold, with some local accounts holding that temperatures reached as low as -20 Fahrenheit. Colonel Connor had intended for he and his men to leave their camp and move out for their final approach to the Shoshone village at about 1 a.m. in the morning. However, the inclement weather and their inability to procure a local guide had delayed their departure until 3 a.m., costing them valuable time. When the company finally did ride out of their camp, roughly 1/3 of their men had to be left behind, as they had been rendered combat ineffective due to frostbite or some other ailment brought on by the extreme cold. Their field artillery, comprised of the infamous mountain howitzers, had been stalled by the heavy snow, depriving them of another critical element in their attack plan. However, despite these difficulties, the U.S. Army force still far outmatches the Shoshone village, and they intend to carry out their orders to the letter. Now, as Chief Sagwitch and his warriors exit his lodge, they are greeted with the unsettling sight of several dozen of their fellow Shoshone men, women, and children alike milling about in nervous curiosity as they spot the cavalry breaching the hill, the large cloud of vapor still overhanging their position. Within what seems like mere seconds, the soldiers have formed into a battle line, and, mere seconds later, the air is filled with the roar of U.S. Army rifles, as Shoshone throughout the village begin to fall, dead and dying. In an instant, the entire village is thrown into chaos. Any pretense of negotiation has vanished, and now it seems apparent to all within the village that they are easy targets to the cavalry, and that there will be no reprieve from this attack. Seeing the impact of their initial volley, Connor orders his men to make a head-on charge into the village. The soldiers spur their mounts forward, careening down the hill towards the village, their weapons held aloft, and screaming all manner of battle cries. But this initial charge is driven back, with the Shoshone warriors managing to mount a stiff defense as their women and children flee towards the Bear River. Several of the cavalrymen are killed in this first attack, and eventually the line is forced to retreat back to the top of the hill. Here, Connor now divides his forces, ordering his infantry to stay atop the hill to block any Shoshone escape, as the cavalry split into two forces and set out to flank the Shoshone on both sides. From their firing pits behind their ad hoc willow branch wall, the Shoshone are again able to mount a notable defense of their position. But after roughly 2 hours of fending off flanking maneuvers from the cavalry and direct fire from the infantry, they have found themselves running low on ammunition. Some accounts, though not fully verified, hold that several of the warriors even attempt to melt and pour lead bullets during the course of the battle. With the rate of Shoshone fire drastically decreasing, Connor now senses that this is his moment to strike. A charge into the village is ordered, and now a vicious fight unfolds, as warriors seek to defend their families with any weapon they can find. Lead bullets again pour into the village like lethal drops of rain, indiscriminately cutting down men, women, and children alike. As many of the Shoshone make a desperate flight towards the river and attempt to ford its icy waters, most are shot down on its banks. As chaos ensues on the banks of the river, soldiers and warriors alike engage in vicious hand-to-hand combat. By mid-morning, the entire affair is finished. Surveying the damage done during the battle, Connor reports 224 Shoshone killed, with roughly 160 women and children captured. His men set fire to the 70 lodges that make up the village, as well as to the stockpiles of food they have collected for the winter. 170 Shoshone horses are also captured. But this victory has come at a far greater cost than Connor could have first anticipated. Also strewn about the battlefield are the lifeless bodies of 14 American soldiers. 49 more soldiers are wounded, 7 of them mortally. With their prisoners in tow, the soldiers now begin their trek back to their encampment near Franklin, Utah. As they near the settlement, several of the soldiers take the wounded and dying soldiers into their homes in attempts to care for them. At the local church house, townsfolk bring in piles of blankets for the soldiers in an effort to make theirs and their prisoners' stay at least slightly more bearable in the midst of the biting winter cold. The next day, Connor will enlist the service of several dog sled drivers in order to transport his more seriously wounded men to Salt Lake City to receive more comprehensive medical care. Meanwhile, back at Bear River, Chief Sagwitch, who has actually managed to survive the attack, though he has been shot twice in the hand, now attempts to gather all the surviving Shoshone so that they may flee the site of the battle. He and many others are barely clinging to life, having hidden in the icy river until the soldiers had left. Many are on the verge of hypothermia. Many others had faked being dead, lying still and feigning lifelessness until Connor and his men were out of sight. Sagwitch's son, a young man named Bishop Timimbo, had been shot several times, but somehow managed to survive. Now, Sagwitch, his son, and the other survivors make their way hurriedly to the site of a nearby hot springs in order to warm themselves and soothe their injuries. They soon build a fire, doing their best to stay warm, but worrying all the while about the return of another army detachment. This battle, one that will be known to history as the Bear River Massacre, will go down in history as the single deadliest attack on Native peoples at the hands of the U.S. government. While there is notable disparity in the official accounts of Connor and that of the Shoshone, general estimates hold that between 250 and 350 Shoshone perished that day. For years afterwards, local farmers who came into the area would report the ground too littered with bones to effectively plow. Though what would come to be known to history as the Indian Wars would continue for many decades to come, with seminal battles like the Fetterman Massacre, the Battle of the Rosebud, and the Battle of the Little Bighorn, as well as multiple other massacres like those at Sand Creek and Wounded Knee still years in the future. The events of the Bear River Massacre would go unsurpassed in their sheer brutality. But while there are countless battles in the war that spanned generations between the native tribes of North America and the United States Army, for tonight, those are other stories for other times. In the year 1860, as the nation careened towards a civil war, the fight for the Texas frontier raged out west. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we examine a little-known story from this war, in which 2 young working cowboys meet their untimely ends at the hands of the dreaded Comanche, and a local vigilante party seeks to take their revenge. Join us now for the Sabinol River Massacre. West Texas, 1860. As the afternoon sun beats down upon him, local rancher William Davenport drives his 2-horse wagon along the banks of the Sabinol River. He is headed for the town of Uvalde to restock supplies for his farm. For most of the morning and into the afternoon, his mind has wandered into all manner of worries and imaginings as his horse plods his way along the dusty ground. But suddenly, Davenport's attention is rocked to the present when he notices a small dust cloud over the hills. Then he hears the faint but unmistakable war cries of Comanche warriors coming from where the cloud originates. Instantly, he knows what this means. Someone just a few hundred yards away is in very real, very immediate mortal danger. And now, so is he. His grip tightens on his reins as he momentarily ponders his options. He is, like every man traveling in this country, armed. But should he rush over the hill and attempt to help whoever is engaged in a life-or-death battle with the Comanche, he runs the very real risk of meeting an insurmountable force and very likely a hard death out here in the sparse, hot expanses of Texas. But if he does not help, he runs the almost equally horrifying prospect of leaving his fellow countrymen to their own horrifying, possibly prolonged and painful deaths. As Davenport considers his options, it is clear that even the horses know that something is amiss and danger is afoot. As they paw the ground and nervously snort and twitch, Davenport stares at the ridge separating himself from the ongoing attack. His decision is not an easy one. At the same time as Davenport agonizes over his moral dilemma, two local cowhands by the last names of Huffman and Wolf are caught in a fight for their lives, one that seems to the young men to be unfolding at a sickeningly fast pace. Swirling all around them, in a whirling dervish of horseflesh, bullets, and arrows, a large party of Comanche warriors rains down projectiles upon them, taunting them with war cries and exhortations. As the two young men do their best to load, fire, and then reload their six-shot revolvers, their minds fight back memories of the countless stories of those men unfortunate enough to be taken alive by the Comanche. The ongoing war between the Comanche and the Texans has, even at this point in 1860, raged for decades all across the Texas frontier. To the Comanche, the Texans are but the latest in a long line of intruders into their territory, one who, like the Mexicans, the Spanish, and the Apache before them, would eventually either fall to the Comanche war machine or retreat from their lands. Though there had been periods of relative peace in the preceding years, raids have only intensified as unrest in the eastern United States has briefly forestalled American expansion and required the attention of the local population of fighting-aged males. The Comanche, perceiving the Americans' grip on the frontier to be increasingly tenuous, view the opportunity as carte blanche to raid the burgeoning settlements along the Texas River valleys, and to do so with seemingly complete impunity. There is, also, the generation-spanning cultural necessity of revenge killing and hostage-taking. In the years since the late 1830s, the entirety of the Comanche tribe, comprised of numerous autonomous bands ranging from central Texas to Colorado to Kansas, have suffered greatly themselves under countless plagues of diseases such as cholera and smallpox. This, of course, in addition to the countless young men, women, children, and elders who have perished in both combat and expeditionary campaigns under Spanish, Mexican, and Texan leadership. Now, as tensions between the northern and southern states fester in the lands to the east, the Comanche are intent on exacting their vengeance for the devastation they have incurred. Unfortunately for Huffman and Wolf, they have now found themselves directly in the path of the Comanche's ire, and now their own destruction seems all but assured. Though the two men are too engulfed in their tasks of aiming and firing to voice these fears, the rising terror between the two is palpable. The Comanche, vastly outnumbering and expertly outmaneuvering them, seem to be taunting them, enjoying this engagement as a cat might enjoy toying with a mouse before killing it. An eerie chill creeps into the bones of both young cowboys as they now fear their fates are all but sealed, unless, that is, some sort of reinforcements come to their aid. For their parts, they have no idea that the rancher Davenport is just over the hill to their back. All they know is that they are here now. Just this morning, they had risen, eaten breakfast, and saddled their horses, preparing for another day as working cowboys in the wilds of Texas. While pursuing a number of missing cattle, they had happened upon this large, wandering band of Comanche raiders about a mile east of the Sabinol River. Seeing they would have no chance should they attack the Comanche, the pair had wheeled their horses around and made a mad dash for the relative cover of the brush, rocks, and sloping embankments of the edges of the river. The Comanche had spotted the two cowboys at almost the same instant, and now a sizable contingent of warriors, several dozen strong, pursue Huffman and Wolf to the river. As the two young cowboys urged their horses on at full speed in a desperate bid to reach the riverbanks, the Comanche war party, on their small, rough-shod ponies, began to seemingly inch ever closer. Within moments, bullets and arrows fill the air, as do the shrill war cries of the pursuing warriors. Turning in their saddles, both Huffman and Wolf fire several shots from their revolvers, hoping to, at least, create some amount of space between themselves and the Comanche. Finally, though, several Comanche manage to catch up and swarm in and around the two cowboys. Now cut off from the river, Huffman and Wolf pull their horses to a stop at a large oak tree several dozen yards from the river. This sends those warriors nearest to them now careening past them, as the pair leap from their horses and hunker down at the base of the oak tree. The Comanche now whirl all around them in a cyclone of violence, firing arrows from below the necks of their horses. Finally, after a desperate few minutes, Huffman and Wolf, knowing they cannot hold their position at the base of the tree, both make a desperate sprint for the river. Though they are both likely wounded and in shock, the men run as far as they are able. Within moments, though, they are surrounded by the Comanche. In a desperate last bid, both young men empty their weapons into the pursuing party at close range, hoping to dispatch as many of their attackers as possible before they themselves are struck down. Both Huffman and Wolf are determined not to be taken alive. As their last shots ring out, Comanche arrows strike them from all angles, leaving them floundering and finally falling hard to the ground. Meanwhile, just over the hill, William Davenport hears the fight unfold. Finally, after fretfully considering his options, he decides to wheel his cart around and rapidly make his way back to his ranch, some 3 miles away. While his assistance may indeed be the defining factor in helping those unfortunate souls over the hill from him, it could also very well spell his own demise. This choice is one that is all too often presented by the hands of fate on the Texas frontier. Now, as Davenport drives his cart onto the property and hurriedly makes preparations for any possible Comanche attack to come, another group of Texans is making their way down the Sabine River in search of the attacking Comanche party. Only the day prior, not far up the river, this same party had ambushed and killed a Mexican sheepherder, slowly and callously torturing the poor man to death. After his body had been found, this ad hoc force of frontier vigilantes had assembled just this morning. At around the same time, the two young cowboys and Huffman and Wolf had finished their breakfast. The posse had taken to the trail of the Comanche in hopes of exacting their revenge and preventing any further attacks. But as this party now comes upon a scene of trampled earth and items such as canteens, bedrolls, and foodstuffs strewn all about the ground, each man among them is beset with the sickening feeling that they have failed in their goal. Next, they come upon the oak tree under which the two cowboys had made their last stand. Its sizable trunk is filled with arrows, giving it the appearance of an arboreal porcupine. The bodies of Huffman and Wolf lie only 150 yards away, but in the posse's haste, and amidst the brush and tall grass, they go unnoticed. However, a body is finally spotted several dozen yards away. The party rushes over, expecting to find the freshly slain body of one of their fellow Texans. Instead, they find the body of a Comanche warrior, struck dead by a shot to the neck. His comrades have not left his body here devoid of honors, though, as he has been wrapped tightly in a blanket His eyes have been shut and covered in red paint, and his body lashed to a tree branch, giving him the illusion of sitting upright. Next to his body, hung on another low branch, is his bow. The Comanche trail clearly leads away from this warrior's body, and, not wanting to lose precious time in further search of the deceased Huffman and Wolf, they follow it, in hopes of at least retrieving the horses the Comanche have stolen. After heading northwest on the trail of the raiding party for the remainder of the afternoon, they finally come upon the Comanche just as the sun is setting. The warriors have made a cold camp, with no fire, and are now bedding down for the night. Their newly gotten herd of stolen horses now grazes, not far from the camp. A brief meeting is now held amongst the Texans, and, in hushed tones, it is agreed that the only course of action is to attack directly and immediately. The Comanche, consumed in their duties of bedding down for the night, remain unaware of the Texans' presence. Suddenly, the quiet of their evening is broken by the wild cries and gunshots of the attacking Texans, all of whom now ride at full speed towards their camp, raining gunfire down upon them. A brief fight unfolds, one that sees the Comanche exercise discretion as the better part of valor as they abandon their horse herd and disappear into the nearby cedar breaks on foot, leaving the valuable animals to be taken by their enemies. One of the animals, a mule, is saddled and appears thoroughly drenched in sweat. A revolver hangs from a scabbard on the saddle. Both the saddle and pistol are thought to be Huffman's. It is also surmised that both he and Wolf, almost certainly, are both dead. The horses and mules are summarily rounded up, and the Texans now make their own hasty retreat back to the southeast, towards the nearby settlement of Rancheros Creek. Here, they corral the animals and spend the night, before heading out again in the morning with the grisly task of locating and burying the bodies of Huffman and Wolf. This time, after a thorough search of the battlefield near the arrow-riddled tree, they find the bodies of the two young men, strewn out in desperate positions at the spot where they had fallen, in between the oak tree and the river. At this spot, hours are spent laboriously digging graves for each man. The men take turns, with two men taking turns digging, while their comrades keep a watchful eye on the surrounding area for any sign of a Comanche attack. By the time the long, hot afternoon begins to drag on, the stiffened, mutilated bodies of Huffman and Wolf are carefully laid into their freshly dug graves, and, with as much respect and reverence as can be mustered considering the still dangerous circumstances, they are laid to rest. Though it can never be determined with any absolute certainty, the men in the burial party discuss how the fight could have possibly unfolded. Huffman's revolver was found completely empty, indicating that he had fired off every available round in his last attempts to fight off the Comanche. Wolf's revolver, despite an extensive search, is never found, though it is presumed taken by the Comanche. It is presumed also that both men fought to their very last, as all signs of mutilation appear to be post-mortem. However tragic, this scene is not at all uncommon on the bleeding edges of the Texas frontier. In the coming days and weeks, the bodies of several other victims of local Comanche attacks will be laid to rest. A local Catholic priest will oversee the funeral of the local sheepherder who had been so cruelly tortured to death. He will then attend the exhumation of the body of Huffman, a German Catholic, before presiding over the reinterment of his body at the Catholic cemetery at the nearby Dahani settlement. In the following 5 years, the bloodshed caused by the charnel house of the American Civil War would consume much of Texas's resources, manpower, and attention. Texas would play a complex and significant role in the war, one shaped by its geography, politics, economy, and fiercely independent culture. The state would secede from the Union on March 2, 1861. As the largest state in the Confederacy by area, Texas would provide critical resources, manpower, and strategic advantages, though it would also face internal divisions and harsh wartime consequences. Governor Sam Houston, a Unionist and veteran of the Texas Revolution, strongly opposed secession and refused to swear loyalty to the Confederacy. As a result, he was removed from office, symbolizing the deep divides even within the state's leadership. Despite Houston's resistance, the majority of Texans would vote in favor of leaving the Union, aligning themselves with the other southern states. Texas's military contribution to the Confederate cause would be significant. An estimated 90,000 Texans would serve in the Confederate forces, fighting in every major theater of war from Virginia to New Mexico. The state would also contribute key officers to the Confederate cause, including General Albert Sidney Johnston, who would die at the Battle of Shiloh, and John Bell Hood, whose Texas Brigade would become one of the most celebrated in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Beyond manpower, Texas would serve as an economic and logistical lifeline. It was one of the few Confederate states largely untouched by Union occupation, and its proximity to Mexico would allow Confederate forces to bypass the Union blockade via overland trade routes. Goods, weapons, and cotton were smuggled through ports like Brownsville and Matamoros, providing a vital economic artery for the struggling Confederacy. In the war's aftermath, Texas faced Reconstruction under federal oversight, like the other former Confederate states. Slavery was abolished, and the state was required to rewrite its constitution and swear loyalty to the Union. Though reintegrated into the United States in 1870, Texas, like much of the South, struggled with the political, social, and economic ramifications of the war for decades. The Comanche, meanwhile, would continue their rule over the majority of Texas and remain the undisputed rulers of the Southern Plains. As battles like Antietam, Shiloh, Gettysburg, and countless others raged to the east, the Comanche will carry out some of their most ruthless, brutal raiding yet on the settlers encroaching upon the Texas frontier. In instances that are too numerous to recall, entire families would be wiped out. Homesteads that one day bustled with children at play and adults at work would fall silent in death and destruction the very next. Terror would continue to grip the frontier for the remainder of the decade and well into the next. Even after the Comanche were eventually relegated to the reservations in Oklahoma, and decades had passed since the last raid, survivors would speak in horror of their recollections. For their part, the Texans will find themselves largely underfunded and overwhelmed with the task of stopping the Comanche during the period of the Civil War. And thus, the seemingly unstemmable cycle of violence would continue as the war for Texas raged on. But the many tales of the bloody meetings between the Texans and the mighty Comanche nation are, for tonight, other stories for other times. In the summer of 1873, the last great intertribal battles between two of the most powerful tribes on the Great Plains took place. The Pawnee, out on their last free buffalo hunt, would be ambushed by their longtime enemies, the Lakota. The results would shock the entire nation. This is the story of the horrors of Massacre Canyon. Southwestern Nebraska, August 5, 1873. A group of Pawnee hunters crouched low in the prairie grass so as not to betray their silhouettes against the pre-dawn skyline. They are led by a respected tribal leader, Sky Chief. Amongst the hunters is Sky Chief's young son, a young boy who is no more than 6 or 7 years old. Though too young to participate in this hunt, he is excited and proud to be along with this group of grown men whom he idolizes and so often emulates. Their quarry on this summer morning is a herd of buffalo, several hundred strong, from which the Pawnee hope to harvest a sizable bounty of hides, horns, and hooves, as well as stores of invaluable meat, organs, and fat that will see them through another harsh plains winter. The Pawnee had once been a formidable force on the central plains of the North American continent. In the early 1700s, they had numbered 60,000 people and controlled vast swaths of what is today the American Midwest. But after almost 2 centuries of disease and warfare, their numbers have dwindled to a few thousand. By 1873, they have acquiesced to the U.S. government's attempt to confine them to reservation lands in Nebraska. This buffalo hunt, a long-standing tradition amongst the tribe, had only been granted to them in the previous few years as a final opportunity to practice their ways and to fortify their winter food supply at little to no cost to the federal government. The year prior, in 1872, they had been accompanied by a contingent of agency scouts led by Texas Jack Umahundro, a legendary scout, cowboy, eventual actor, and longtime friend of Buffalo Bill Cody. As the agency scouts stood watch and provided protection to the camp, the Pawnee men were able to venture out to hunt without fear of retributive attacks from their longtime enemy, the Lakota. Under the watchful eye of well-armed sentries, the Pawnee had managed to procure enough buffalo meat to get them through the upcoming winter. However, the Lakota had raided their reservation incessantly during the winter of 1872 to 1873, and the Pawnee suffered greatly as a result. In the springtime, the Pawnee chiefs conferred and decided that another hunt was indeed wholly necessary for the survival of their tribe. They petitioned the federal agents of the reservation for another contingent of scouts. They requested that these scouts be led by Texas Jack, as he had comported himself so reputably during the summer prior, and thus solidified a lifelong respect and companionship between himself and the Pawnee. But in the interim time between the summer of 1872 and the spring of 1873, several major changes had occurred in the administration of the Pawnee Reservation, known as the Genoa Agency. First, a new superintendent had been installed. His name was William Burgess, and like his predecessor since 1869, he was a Quaker. President Ulysses S. Grant had installed Quakers as Indian agents in the hopes that contact with pacifist, peaceable whites would quell the raging frontier violence that had plagued the continent for centuries and stalled American expansion for decades. Grant, in fact, believed that the root cause of much of the violence on the bleeding frontier was due to the treatment of the native tribes by the overly aggressive, needlessly bellicose, and haplessly short-sighted settlers. He hoped this plan would stem the tide of violence that, at times, seemed like it might overrun a third of the country, but he would be gravely disappointed. From the very start, William Burgess had not inspired confidence in his leadership abilities. Luther North, a revered member of the Scouts that had served the reservation, described Burgess as woefully unqualified, noting that, quote, "His judgment where the Pawnee are concerned, if anything, is poorer than any of the other agents the Pawnees have had." Burgess had attempted to address the terrible situations at the reservation by passing out annual rations earlier than promised, but this proved an inadequate solution to the poverty and starvation that plagued the tribe. Feeling as though he had little other feasible course of action, Burgess authorized the tribe to travel to the Republican River in hopes of repeating the previous year's hunting success and placating the Pawnee for one last year until they could be brought fully to bear as idealized American citizens. The plans for the excursion began in late spring, with the initial intent being to repeat the steps taken in the previous year's hunt. Texas Jack was asked to lead the agency's scouting party, and a wave of much-needed hopefulness spread through the desperate, hungry camp as spring turned to summer. However, due to an administrative oversight on behalf of the reservation agents, the Pawnee were ultimately unable to secure Texas Jack's services. Though he had repeatedly applied to lead the Pawnee party, no word had come in return. With no confirmatory word from the Genoa agency, Texas Jack had signed on to appear in Buffalo Bill Cody's stage show in New York, and was thus drawn away by his new obligation. The Pawnee, now bereft of an agency representative they considered trustworthy in the field, beseeched Burgess to grant the position to a 22-year-old Wisconsin-born homesteader named John W. Williamson. Williamson had signed on that spring as an agriculturalist for Fort Genoa and had solidified a mutually congenial relationship with the Pawnee. He had no experience in guiding on the trail, no experience in the territory, and spoke only passable Pawnee, and, being all too keenly aware of these facts himself, had never applied for nor expressed any interest in leading the Pawnee hunting expedition. The Pawnee hoped that this might work in their favor, as Williamson's lack of territorial and tactical wherewithal would likely mean drastically less strict practices than those employed by Texas Jack. This hunt could very well be their last hurrah on the Great Plains, and the Pawnee did not want it interfered with by what they viewed as an overly restrictive white man, no matter how reputable, well-liked, and well-intentioned Texas Jack may have been. Burgess, believing he had no better immediate options, acquiesced to the Pawnee's request for Williamson to be installed as the nominal leadership. The Pawnee had ventured out from Fort Genoa in a party of roughly 400, mostly women and children. They had made their way, in high spirits, to the hunting grounds on the Republican River, believing themselves adequately protected and free of some of the previous year's more burdensome restrictions. Initially, the hunt had been a rousing success. In the month of hunting leading up to this day, the Pawnee have managed to harvest roughly 800 buffalo. Each animal killed means a measure of security for their families, and all present have, thus far, been pleased with their progress. On this day, though, something is different. The air seems unusually thick, and the buffalo more skittish than usual. The evening prior, a group of white buffalo hunters had stopped by the Pawnee encampment. They had warned Williamson and Sky Chief that they had seen a large encampment of the Pawnee's mortal enemy, the Lakota, 25 miles upriver. They had warned that the Lakota party was clearly on the warpath and undoubtedly on the hunt for the Pawnee. Word had spread quickly amongst the Lakota that the Pawnee were back this summer on the Republican River, lands that the Lakota hold to be rightfully theirs. The white hunters had warned that the Lakota were out for blood. Sky Chief had scoffed at this notion and decried the hunters as simply more lying white men, trying to keep him and his people from their rightful hunting grounds. But now, as he hunkers down watching the buffalo herd and mindfully keeping his young son close to him, Sky Chief begins to wonder if those hunters had in fact been telling the truth. Then he hears the hoofbeats. Suddenly, a party of 50 Lakota warriors on horseback and in full war regalia crests the ridge behind the Pawnee. Almost instantaneously, the two parties, Lakota and Pawnee, are in sight of each other. Some accounts have Sky Chief and his warriors as being in the middle of skinning some of the buffalo they have already killed. However, in either account, the Pawnee have been caught wholly unprepared to defend themselves. It is clear to Sky Chief at a moment's glance that this small party of Lakota are the initial scouts sent out to find and make first contact with the Pawnee. He knows that the contingent now attacking himself and his warriors is likely but a fraction of the entire Lakota force. As the Lakota let loose their piercing war cries and barrel down the ridge towards them, the Pawnee hunting party knows there will be no surviving this morning. Within moments, Sky Chief, his young son, and the remainder of his forces are cut down. The Lakota will later report taking no prisoners from this attack, leaving all Pawnee present lying still in death. Having located their enemy, the Lakota reconnaissance party of roughly 50 warriors makes their way back to the main contingent of Lakota, roughly 1,000 strong, hidden behind a bluff a few miles away. After being alerted by the reconnaissance party, this larger war party, under the leadership of War Chiefs Littletail and the aptly named Pawnee Killer, immediately ride out towards the remainder of the Pawnee. The remaining Pawnee, with only 100 warriors left and the rest being women and children, are making their way down a canyon near the Republican River when the Lakota smash into them in a whirlwind of violence and bloodshed. The battle that further ensues is unbelievably fierce, with every man present knowing that the fate of his family would be the same as that of Sky Chief his men, and his young son. Though they fight valiantly, the majority of the Pawnee warriors are simply and quickly overwhelmed and cut down. Williamson and 2 older Pawnee men managed to make an escape back to the west in hopes of linking up with the nearest U.S. Army element in the area and procuring assistance. However, they will not make it back in time. The surviving Pawnee women and children have retreated into the canyon and are now trapped within its recesses. One by one, young and old are ruthlessly hunted down and taken prisoner, or immediately dispatched at the end of Lakota arrows and lances. Though many are cut down, many are taken prisoner, all of them knowing that their fates now will likely be worse than their deceased comrades. Any valuables that can be carried are tied down to Lakota horses. Then, almost as suddenly as they had struck, the entire party of Lakota, with their newly taken trophies and prisoners in tow, are off, over the hills, and seemingly free from worry of pursuit or retribution. Only hours later, in the afternoon of August 5th, U.S. cavalry soldiers who had been alerted by Williamson and his cohorts arrive on the scene. Riding with them is Army Dr. David Franklin Powell. Surveying the horrific scene, he counts 59 Pawnee bodies. Visitors from nearby towns, who have been alerted to the events and come to see the aftermath themselves, count there to be significantly more. Correspondent Royal Buck of the Nebraska City News wrote that it was a massacre and nothing more, and nearly 100 victims are lying on the ground, and 2/3 are squaws and papooses, small Indian children. On August 8th, news of the massacre reaches the Pawnee back at the Genoa Agency. For days afterwards, the fort is a cacophonous scene as the weeping and lamentations of the Pawnee women fill the air. Meanwhile, a few Pawnee who have managed to escape the canyon make their way 80 miles to what's known as Plum Creek, an offshoot of the Platte River. Here, they are tended to by Dr. William M. Bancroft, and then put on a train back to Fort Genoa. For weeks afterwards, Lakota warriors are spotted in various camps about the prairies, proudly displaying their war trophies. In a visceral display of the generations-long enmity between the two tribes, it is apparent to outside observers that what had been a horrific massacre to the Pawnee was a just and necessary victory in the eyes of the Lakota, one that, by its very nature, warranted great pride and celebration. Lakota accounts of the battle report as many as 300 Pawnee being killed, with no Lakota casualties being taken. The events of Massacre Canyon in 1873 are, to be sure, unique, but not in their level of ferocity, nor in the scope of their violence, nor in the intensity of the disdain between the two tribes, nor the grief inflicted and suffered by both. Instead, Massacre Canyon will be unique in the history of the Old West because it will mark the last great battle between Plains tribes on the North American continent. However, in the scope of history, the stories of warfare, raiding, violence, and atrocities between tribes are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. September 16th, 1868, Eastern Colorado. As the late summer sun sinks into the horizon, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors sit in a loose circle around a cooking fire, enjoying an evening meal. Among them is a 45-year-old Cheyenne warrior named Roman Nose. He is a decades-long veteran of countless battles against settlers and soldiers from the United States, as well as raids against rival tribes. In the illustrious career he has compiled, Roman Nose has accrued many honors and a reputation amongst his people, his allies, and his enemies as a formidable tactician and a vicious fighter. Since the devastating Sand Creek Massacre of November 29, 1864, in which dozens or possibly hundreds of his fellow Cheyenne, men, women, and children, were mowed down without mercy at the command of Colonel John Chivington, Roman Nose had extracted his proverbial pound of flesh from the encroaching white settlers with a myopic fury. He had been born into a band of the Northern Cheyenne around the year 1823, son of a prominent warrior named Lone Bear and a beautiful and highly regarded mother named Black Buffalo Woman. Though as a child he had gone by the name Moseskanetsa Nunahe, or Bat, he had acquired the name Wokini, or Hook Nose, from his notable physical features, a name which the Americans would interpret as Roman Nose. He had fought at the Battle of Julesburg in Wyoming in 1865, and wrought terror and trepidation upon travelers all along the segment of the Oregon Trail that stretched to the northern plains. He had visited Fort Larned in April of the previous year, during which Isaac Coates, U.S. General Winston Scott Hancock's surgeon, observed Roman Nose in an argument with the general, noting that, "Of all the chiefs, he is one of the fittest specimens, physically, of his race. He is quite 6 feet in height, finely formed with a large body and muscular limbs. His appearance was decidedly military, and on this occasion particularly so, since he wore the uniform of a general in the army. A 7-shooting Spencer carbine hung at the side of his saddle, 4 large Navy revolvers stuck in his belt, and a bow, already strung with arrows, were grasped in his left hand. Thus armed and mounted on a fine horse, he was a good representative of the god of war, and his manner showed plainly that he did not care if we talked or fought." Though he holds no formal position of leadership within the Cheyenne, Roman Nose has built his stature within the tribe and their allies through countless battles, raids, and buffalo hunts. All throughout his travels and fighting, Roman Nose had fought fearlessly, partly due to his own personal resolve and disposition, and partly due to his belief that his war bonnet possessed a protective magic over him that afforded him protection from the white man's weapons. He had received the war bonnet as a gift from the Lakota warrior White Bull, who assured him no harm would come to him while he wore the headdress, so long as he did not violate its medicine by consuming any food prepared with the white man's metal utensils. Known amongst his people as a deeply spiritual man, Roman Nose abided by these directives fastidiously. In addition to following the prescription of White Bull, Roman Nose would partake in days-long fasts from food and water, often arriving late to battles due to his extensive prayer routine. Still though, despite his trademark tardiness, Roman Nose has, and especially the last few months, been the terror of the United States government, marauding about his high plains homelands, wreaking havoc and killing soldiers and settlers wherever he can. The preceding summer months have been busy, hot, and bloody. But now, for a brief moment, as he sits here with his fellow warriors enjoying a warm piece of fry bread freshly made by a Sioux woman serving as cook for the camp, all seems well, at least momentarily. Then, with all the disruption of a rifle's retort, the cry comes out from returning scouts that a contingent of white soldiers has been spotted nearby, and that an attack must be made as soon as possible. As he has so many times before, Roman Nose halts his meal and makes ready for the attack that will take place the next day. Just as he is making his way back to his lodge, one of his warrior cohorts rushes up to him, eyes wide in panic. The warrior informs Roman Nose that the Sioux woman who served them their dinner, not knowing of Roman Nose's prohibition against eating food prepared with metal utensils, had used a metal spoon to serve up their dinner. This action, though unintentional, now has resounding consequences. Roman Nose now believes his medicine, the great protection offered by his war bonnet, has been compromised. The Cheyenne medicine man's ceremony for ostensibly restoring the power to the headdress will take days, a luxury the mighty warrior does not now have. As the night drags on, Roman Nose contemplates his next move, the millstone of fate weighing heavy on his mind. Only 12 miles away, on the dry fork of the Republican River, on the south bank of what is known as Delaware Creek, 27-year-old First Lieutenant Frederick Henry Beecher works alongside his men preparing their camp for the night. They are a unique contingent of both U.S. Army soldiers and civilian frontiersmen, a combined force of 50 in number, assembled for the express purpose of pursuing and combating the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who have been so unyielding in their attacks in the previous few weeks. Commanding them is Major General George Alexander Forsyth of the 9th Cavalry, who had begun his career in 1861 as a lieutenant in the 8th Illinois Cavalry. Forsyth saw action in the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864, served as aide-de-camp for Major General Philip Sheridan, and had been awarded a brevet promotion to colonel on October 19th of 1864 for his actions during the Third Battle of Winchester and the Battle of Cedar Creek. Earlier in this year, he had been charged with assembling this motley band, whose ages ranged from their late teens to their early 60s. Beecher serves as second in command for this group, himself a veteran of the Civil War, acting as first lieutenant of the 16th Maine Volunteers from 1862 to 1864. He had fought at the Battle of Brooks Station, the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Battle of Chancellorsville, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg. He had been severely wounded twice, at both Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, as well as Gettysburg on July 1st of 1863. At the Battle of Gettysburg, he had also received a citation for valor after refusing to surrender the regimental colors to the attacking Confederate forces. He was born in New Orleans in June of 1841 and graduated from Bowdoin College in Maine before volunteering for the Union Army. His family is one of prominent American stock, with his uncle Henry Ward Beecher being perhaps the most prominent Methodist preacher in America at the time. His aunt, Harriet Beecher Stowe, is perhaps the most famous writer in America, having authored the seminal fictional work in abolitionism at the time, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had served as a major media flashpoint in the galvanization of the country on the issue of slavery. His family is known as some of the most prominent and influential abolitionists in the whole of the Northeast. But they are also Americans, with a strident fidelity to their newly resolved Union and possessing no small amount of fervor for the fulfillment of the notion of manifest destiny. The country, fresh out of conflict within itself, now seems, 3 years after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, unapologetically obsessed with their own reconstruction and expansion. Both reconstruction and expansion, though, have thus far come at great cost. In the South, unrest continues to run rampant, with the seeds of long-held resentments being sowed far and wide. In the West, the ongoing war between the United States government and the menagerie of tribes that range from Mexico to Canada has once again become red-hot after 4 years of a comparative lull in heavy fighting. Though conflict on the bleeding edge of the frontier had indeed raged throughout the entirety of the American Civil War, it was only after 1865 that the federal government could marshal the might of their full resources in the fight against the Plains tribes. The mere existence of this 50-man force, though, now unfurling their bedrolls and picketing their horses down for the night, is evidence of the U.S. Army's assessment of the situation on the high plains as a desperate one that calls for desperate measures if the attacks made by warriors who oftentimes have personal ties to those massacred by Shivington and company at Sand Creek are to ever be abated. On the morning of September 10th, this detachment had left Fort Wallace, located in present-day Kansas, following the trail of what they initially believed to be a force of 25 native warriors who had attacked a work detail roughly 13 miles from the fort. The trail, however, soon began to show signs of a far larger force of native Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors in the vicinity. This prospect, though, was an enticing one for many in the party, as the largest problem for many units fighting on the open plains was not as much in combating the native warriors in battle, but in actually finding them in the first place. The vast majority of the time, pursuing soldiers and citizens alike saw their attackers, or their quarry, depending on the situation, disappear with specter-like ease into the seemingly endless flat grasslands. Now, as men begin to doze off and others take their turns standing watch, the night drags on, under the splendor of the northern plains sky. Many amongst them have lost friends and loved ones to the attacks of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, and now burn for revenge that they hope is finally all too close at hand. However, even the most fervent pursuer amongst them would likely be shocked, and perhaps slightly horrified, to know that a massive camp of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, hundreds or perhaps thousands strong, lies only a dozen miles away from their force of 50 men. But when the sun breaches the eastern horizon on the morning of the 17th, the rude awakening for this small force is at hand, both literally and figuratively. Silhouetted by the rising sun, lining the ridge tops around them, are hundreds of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, resplendent in their war paint
and letting loose war cries that jar awake those who have not yet been alerted by the men on watch. As First Lieutenant Beecher wipes the sleep from his eyes and takes stock of the situation at hand, his mind seems nearly unable to reconcile the bizarre sight before him. Not only are hundreds of warriors on the hilltops above them, but also are the wives and children of the warriors, looking on and exhorting their husbands and fathers to glory. Overseeing them from a distance is Roman Nose. Though not a formal chief, his leadership on the battlefield has been a pivotal element in the native warriors' successes in the preceding years. Now, as he watches on, Roman Nose fights a growing sense of self-consciousness as some among his people trade curious glances and hushed whispers as their best warrior only watches the battle about to take place. The word has gone out amongst the assembled Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that no warrior should make any rash moves. Their prey is cornered, and to the eyes of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors present, they are helpless. But as young men are often wont to do, a group of 8 teenage warriors make a foolhardy attempt at stampeding the soldiers' horses. Some of the 50 Americans fire upon them with their Spencer repeating carbines, a new technology that allows rapid reloading as opposed to the muzzle-loading rifles and muskets of only a few years prior. Though none of the young warriors are killed in their attempt, the first shots of the fight have now been fired, and now a torrent of violence is unleashed, as rapid charges are made upon the small camp, with war cries filling the air, mixing with the sounds of commands in English and the cheering of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho women and children in their respective languages. As the attacks persist, First Lieutenant Beecher coolly and calmly fires upon the charging warriors, while encouraging his men to take accurate shots and remain courageous despite their obvious numerical disadvantage. First in command, Major General Forsyth orders the men to retreat across the shallow waters of the river to a small, desolate island located midstream between the north and south banks. Forsyth and Beecher assist their 48 men in forming a barricade with the very horses they had led across the river, tying the animals off to bushes and taking cover behind them. Almost as soon as the men are able to take their positions behind their unfortunate means of cover, another series of attacks ensues, again swarming down upon them seemingly from all directions. One after another, the horses tied off to the bushes are felled by arrows and bullets from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. As the men continue to take fire, more and more among them recognize the riotous crack of the rifles carried by the native warriors. The chilling realization falls upon the men, now ensconced upon this barren strip of earth in the middle of a sparse high-plain stream, that they are being fired upon with Henry and Spencer repeating rifles. Some of these weapons have been procured by the warriors from both prior victories, such as the utter massacre wrought upon the cavalry in the Fetterman massacre of a year and a half prior. Some of the repeating rifles, though, a technology that had been a singular means of advantage for the U.S. cavalry over the Plains tribes, have been provided by the United States government's Bureau of Indian Affairs, under the pretense that they would only be used for hunting. Despite the vehement assertions to the contrary from countless correspondence penned by Army officers in the field to their superiors in Washington, D.C., besieging them to stop this clearly conflicting practice, no such effort has been made by this summer of 1868. Now, as their horses are being killed by bullets funded by their own government, the men on the island's situation is rapidly becoming more and more dire. Forsyth and Beecher agree that the only course of action left is to kill the remaining horses and order the men to dig in more substantial breastworks behind the animals' bodies. As things are, the men are far too exposed, and their small force can now only hope to hunker down and hold their position. As the iron stink of blood and viscera permeate the air, the men dig in desperate, intermittent fits, stopping only to fire on assailing bands of attacking warriors who incessantly pester them with attacks. Some of the warriors take a more surreptitious route of attack, sneaking into the thick grass that lines the riverbanks and sniping at the men now effectively trapped on the island. As the fight drags on, the mighty Roman Nose continues to watch from a distance. Initially, he had thought that his participation in the fight today may indeed prove unnecessary. With the enemy trapped and assumed to be at the mercy of antiquated weaponry, he had hoped this might be a chance for some of the younger warriors to make their own marks in their initial forays into combat. But as the afternoon sun burns brighter and hotter, and more young warriors fall to the Americans' repeating rifles, Roman Nose becomes more and more burdened by his own internal dialogue heaping guilt upon himself. Then, an old Cheyenne woman, observing this revered warrior not participating in the fight, begins to mercilessly chastise him. She browbeats him with accusations of laziness and, worse, cowardice, charging that the lives of young warriors lost today will be due to his reticence to act. Finally, Roman Nose can take no more. "I will die," he says, in a low, resigned tone, "but I will go." Despite the gravity of the situation, Roman Nose fastidiously paints his face and torso, checks his weapons, says his prayers, and finally dons his legendary war bonnet. The war bonnet itself speaks to the bizarre and desperate nature of the fate of these two groups brought together here today in combat in one of the most austere environments on the continent. The following is a description of the bonnet itself, made years later by the warrior who had constructed it, White Bull, as told by George P. Grinnell. Instead of having two buffalo horns attached at the headband, one on each side, it had but one rising over the center of the forehead. It had a very long tail that touched the ground, even when Roman Nose was mounted. This tail was made of a strip of young buffalo hide and had eagle feathers all along its length. First 4 red feathers, then 4 black ones, then 4 red feathers again, and so on. 40 feathers in all. For 8 years, Roman Nose has participated in fight after fight, in full confidence that the medicine from his headpiece will protect him from harm. Now, believing its powers compromised and that it will serve merely as an ornament in his own demise, he pulls the war bonnet down upon his head and rides out with a small group of fellow warriors to make an attack on the island. Again, as they had countless times before, he and his fellow warriors steel their nerves in the last seconds before urging their war horses forward at full speed towards the small island. The attack comes on, with the Americans at the island holding their fire until the mighty warriors are only 50 yards away before unleashing a volley of fire from their repeating rifles, followed in rapid succession by another and another. In the melee, Roman Nose is grievously wounded by a bullet to his torso. After a short fight, the force retreats over the hilltops and back to the village. Here, the mighty Roman Nose is pulled from his horse, his condition rapidly declining due to organ damage and loss of blood. He is taken inside of one of the lodges where medicine is applied to his wound, but his condition continues to rapidly deteriorate. By sunrise, the legendary Cheyenne warrior, who had fought so long for so hard without incurring so much as a scratch, lies cold in death inside one of the buffalo hide lodges of the village. Wails and lamentations resound, as the loss of such a great warrior and treasured friend is one felt as palpably here on the Great Plains as it is anywhere in the long and brutal course of history. Meanwhile, back on the island, Major General Forsyth now lies prostrate, grievously wounded himself by a bullet lodged in his thigh, dangerously close to his femoral artery. He props himself up on one elbow, giving directions and doing his best to address his own wounds. Suddenly, another charge comes on. Again, the succeeding minutes are filled with the din of gunfire and war cries, until again, the warriors retreat, and all on the island falls silent. Suddenly, to Major General Forsyth and the men's eternal shock and horror, First Lieutenant Beecher wearily stands up, seemingly in some kind of battle-induced stupor. He then falls to one knee, and begins to drag himself towards Forsyth. Beecher cries out, "I have my death wound, General. I am shot in the side, and dying." Forsyth desperately scrambles towards his friend. "No, Beecher, no," he manages to cry out, as the young first lieutenant falls. "Yes, good night," Beecher manages to stoically mumble, before his eyes close, and the soldier, who had survived the horrors of so many battles, utters his final words, "My poor mother." Forsyth and the men now find themselves in a state of shock and nearing despair as they lie prone, several of them injured, and now, with a total of 4 of their forces, including Beecher, Sergeant J.H. Moores, George W. Culver, and William Wilson, also lying dead on the small island in this shallow stream. Their proximity to death, in both time and space, has severely unnerved every man present, whether military or civilian. As the sun sets and a long, worrisome night unfolds, Forsyth considers his options. In the middle of the night, the men huddle behind the swelling and stinking carcasses of their horses and devise a plan. They cannot stay here, it is obvious to all. However, with all of their mounts now serving as defensive breastworks, their only means of escape will be on foot, in the middle of the high plains, with hundreds of warriors swarming the area. This is tantamount to suicide. Still, it is their only hope. Forsyth beseeches the men that someone will have to make the trek to Fort Wallace to request assistance. A 19-year-old named Simpson Jack Stillwell and a veteran French-Canadian trapper named Pierre Avalanche Trudeau, a man thought to be in his 60s but said to look much older, volunteered to make the 70-mile journey southeast, knowing that being caught will mean a certain, horrific death. The men depart before sunrise, walking backwards across the stream in hopes of deterring the native warriors who will eventually surely pursue them. They vanish into the night, and soon the sun rises on another day of hard fighting. Throughout the next 2 days, the intermittent charges from the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors continue, now made even more frequently on foot, with the warriors sneaking as close to the island as possible before springing their attack. The fighting is a hard business, and as the hours drag on, it is believed that the 2 men sent to garner reinforcements have likely been caught and killed in their efforts. After 2 more nights, Major General Forsyth is now faced with 2 pressing dilemmas. One, the men he has sent out are now likely dead, and the only solution is to send another 2 men in hopes of completing a similar distance trek to a stagecoach stop due south of their present location. Here, they can wait for the next stagecoach to Fort Wallace. Scouts John J. Donovan and Allison J. Plilly volunteer for the task, and soon slip across the stream and over the horizon themselves, into the dead of night and dreadful uncertainty. The next problem to be addressed is the bullet lodged in Major General Forsyth's thigh. The projectile is pressing precariously against his femoral artery, and the wound is rapidly becoming vulnerable to infection. However, with the head surgeon having already been killed, Forsyth is unable to convince any of his men to try their hand at the rudimentary frontier surgery required to remove the bullet from his leg. This being the case, Forsyth does so himself, miraculously managing to safely remove the bullet and bandage his injured leg with only a knife as his instrument. Though he is successful in removing the bullet, the fever and ensuing infection leave many in Forsyth's command, believing that he will soon join his friend Beecher in death. Meanwhile, by some other miracle, both rescue parties sent out, that of Stillwell and Trudeau, as well as that of Donovan and Plilly, made their way to Fort Wallace, arriving only hours apart. Reinforcements are marshaled, and on the 25th of September, a full 8 days after killing their horses and digging in behind their corpses, the surviving men left trapped on the island are greeted with the sight of eventual Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Colonel Lewis H. Carpenter and his 10th Cavalry Regiment of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, comprised of newly freed slaves who have volunteered to serve in the dangerous world of the U.S. Army's cavalry. Carpenter and the Buffalo Soldiers themselves are greeted with the sight of 50 dead and rotting horses, as well as 5 dead and rotting bodies of their fellow Americans, as well as the unyielding stench of a week's worth of death and decomposition in combination with a huge swarm of black flies. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, having seen the fight, at least on the whole, as merely another engagement, despite its tragic cost, have now grown tired of making charges on the doomed island and have, in the words of author Terry Mort in his work Cheyenne Summer, made their egress much in the fashion of an audience exiting a theater after a long performance. 5 full days later, on September 30th, the rescue force, as well as the men who had been trapped on the island, forever now known as Forsyth's Scouts, make their way back into the relative safety of the confines of Fort Wallace. Major General Forsyth will go on to survive his wounds, which included another gunshot wound to his torso and a grazing wound to his head, and he will go on to a long career in the U.S. Army. Ultimately, Walter Armstrong, one of the scouts wounded during the fight, will die of his wounds in hospital. He will be buried at Fort Wallace, while his fallen cohorts in Culver, Farley, Wilson, the surgeon Dr. Moores, and First Lieutenant Beecher would all be buried on the island where they fell. Though the course of the river has changed throughout the years, rendering the original site of his grave unknowable, the island itself is today known as Beecher's Island. The final resting place of Roman Nose is, as well, lost to the march of history. After the battle, his body was placed atop a funeral pyre and left to be consumed by the animals and elements, as was the tradition of the Cheyenne. Upon learning about the fight at Beecher's Island, another famous frontier figure, General George Armstrong Custer, remarked that it was the greatest battle on the plains. The consequences of the battles of Beecher's Island would have reverberations that would be felt throughout the next bloody decade of conflict on the plains between the United States Army and tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, Blackfoot, and Comanche. But the stories of those battles, like the bloody tale of Custer's final fight at the Little Bighorn or the tragic massacre at Wounded Knee, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Natchez, Mississippi, September 19, 1827. Just as the late summer sun nears its noontime apex over the Mississippi River, two boats paddled their way through the muddy water towards a small island. With the clear blue sky and warming temperature, the seemingly placid scene might be mistaken for a group of picnic or party-goers making their way to their much-awaited destination. But the business at hand this morning is of a far more serious nature. On this morning, a feud between two prominent local citizens, one Dr. Thomas H. Maddox and one Samuel L. Wells, will be settled. Both men have agreed to settle their long-standing enmity in the form of a pistol duel. After what has amounted to months of negotiations as to the time, place, and conditions of the duel, they have agreed to meet at this neutral site of this island ensconced in the middle of the river. Each are accompanied by their seconds and their surgeons. Among those in the boat with the Wells party is a steely-eyed 31-year-old who, though not one of the duelists scheduled to fight that morning, has set his mind on settling a score of his own on this day. The man's name is James Bowie, otherwise known as Jim Bowie. Born in Kentucky in 1796, Bowie's family had moved to Opelousas, Louisiana in 1812. Here, on the ragged edge of the American frontier, he had grown up hard as the ninth of 10 children. He is known as a man not above working outside the confines of the law, having spent considerable time running what amounted to 19th century real estate scams and capturing and returning escaped slaves to bondage with his brother throughout the 1820s. However, on the frontier, where the rule of law is often seen as more of a subjective measure than an absolute dictate, this has not wholly soured his reputation. Bowie is, in fact, known by many as a congenial, thoughtful individual, quite the conversationalist when he has a mind to be. However, he is also known as a man not to be trifled with, and one not known to forgive a slight to his honor lightly. And on this day, Bowie has his sights set on one Major Norris Wright, a member of the opposing party, and a man whom Bowie has a long-standing, bloody feud. The year prior, Bowie had returned from one of his many trips made in efforts to proffer his ongoing real estate scheme, in which he and his brother John Bowie attempted to lay claim to and sell off parcels of land that did not belong to them. Stepping off of the riverboat and onto the shores of Alexandria, Louisiana, Bowie had been informed by his brother that Wright had been demeaning his reputation about town, calling into question his character and castigating Jim Bowie as a thief and a liar. This was an affront that, in the eyes of Jim Bowie, could not be suffered. He had immediately made his way to Bailey's Hotel, armed with only a pocket knife. Here, he found Wright engaged in a card game. Bowie immediately demanded to know whether the rumors about town were true, and whether or not Wright cared to repeat them now in person. For his part, Wright drew his pistol without so much as a single word, centering the sights on Bowie's torso. At the same time, Bowie had reached up for a chair that was close at hand, raising it up to block himself from the brunt of the forthcoming bullet. For a few tense moments, the pair stood frozen in a standoff, until Bowie had raised the chair above his head in order to attack Wright. Wright had fired, striking Bowie on the left side. The shot had ricocheted off of a coin pouch Bowie carried under his vest, causing only a painful flesh wound. Bowie then lunged at Wright, knocking him to the floor and holding him down with one hand as he struggled to pull his folding pocket knife out with his other. With the blood-soaked hand being too slick to pry open on its own, Bowie placed the blade between his teeth in order to pry it open. The knife was then wrenched from his hands by Wright's friends as they desperately tried to separate the two men. With the knife now gone, Bowie sunk his teeth into the hand of Wright. Finally, he was pried from atop Wright, leaving one of his teeth embedded in Wright's fingers. Though the two were separated, their feud was still unsettled. Bowie was taken upstairs to recuperate, and tensions continued to rise for months. In today's duel, Norris Wright is a member of the supporting party for Dr. Thomas Maddox. Many members of both parties are uneasy that the feud between the two duelists will not be the only conflict settled that day. As the boats pull onto the sandbar shore of the small island, Bowie departs the vessel with the rest of the cohort supporting his friend, Samuel Wells. For roughly 20 minutes, the particulars of the precise location to be used on the island, and arguments over who will be allowed to accompany their fighters, ensue. Interspersed with these heated conversations are the repeated protests being offered up by two members of Dr. Maddox's party, James A. Denny and Robert A. Crane. They urged both duelists to settle their differences in a more amicable fashion, and lament the forthcoming bloodshed. But neither participant can be dissuaded from their aims of settling their feud with pistols. For his part, Bowie remains distant from the proceedings, resting under the shade of a small grove of willows. Though he is ostensibly there only to support his friend, he is keenly aware of the presence of his hated rival, Norris Wright, as a member of the supporting party for Dr. Maddox. In fact, other members of each party have long and torrid histories with one another. Richard Cooney, a member of the Wells party, and Robert Crane also have a long-standing, heated feud themselves, in which Crane has recently threatened to shoot Cooney on sight. These underlying tensions swirl beneath the collective apprehension of all the men now on the small island. Finally, though, matters are settled in preparation for the duel at hand. As Bowie and friends remain under the willow trees, Dr. Maddox and Samuel Wells now take up their pistols, march to their determined positions, take aim, and fire. A large cloud of smoke then obscures the beach as the onlookers brace themselves to see the result. However, in an instance not uncommon in frontier duels, both shots have missed. Attempting to seize this brief but seemingly fortuitous moment, Dr. Denny makes another hardened plea for both participants to set aside their arms and settle their differences peaceably. But again, he is rebuked, as neither Maddox nor Wells feel their honor to have been satisfied. The pistols are reloaded, and again, the combatants take their places, aim, and fire. But, in a miraculous stroke of luck, both shots, again, miss their mark. Finally, with both men feeling as though fate has been amply tempted, Maddox and Wells agree to shake hands and lay their dispute to rest once and for all. Maddox makes his way towards Bowie and the rest of his party, heartily proclaiming that amends have been made and that he intends to now share a glass of wine with his former rival. Maddox, Bowie, and company now make their way towards the party of Samuel Wells, with most in the group being overjoyed at the peaceful outcome of what could have been a tragic affair. However, while Maddox, Wells, and most of the others are in a jovial mood, the pre-existing tensions between both Richard Cooney and Robert Crane reach a flashpoint. As the two parties reach within earshot of each other, Richard Cooney calls out to Robert Crane, saying that, since Crane had previously threatened to shoot him on sight, now would be an opportune time to settle their differences here on the beach. Again, cooler heads on both sides attempt to argue for a peaceable solution, and beseech both men not to break the newly garnered peace between both groups. However, before the situation can be diffused, weapons are drawn. It is unclear who drew their firearm first, but within seconds, several men on both sides, including Jim Bowie, had their pistols drawn and ready to bear. Again, though, the men are convinced to halt in the interest of mutual peace. The men in each party all holster their weapons. All of the men, that is, except for Robert Crane and Jim Bowie. For a fleeting few moments, the armed men are locked in a standoff, unsure of the other's intentions or next moves. Then, suddenly, believing Bowie to be the leader of an ambush, Crane fires his shot first at Bowie. The bullet misses Bowie, as did Bowie's return shot, which, in the closest shot yet of the day, managed to graze the cravat that Crane wore around his neck. But now, any previous peace deal is presumed moot, and full-on, blood-drenched frontier chaos ensues. Crane immediately draws another pistol from his waistband, firing another shot which misses Bowie but strikes his hated rival Richard Cooney in the thigh, severing an artery. He then turns and sprints towards the grove of willow trees in hopes of escaping the retaliation of Jim Bowie, who is now in hot pursuit of the man who has fatally injured his friend. Bowie draws a second pistol himself and fires upon the retreating Crane, but again misses. Now, out of options by way of gunpowder and lead, Bowie reaches for the large leather scabbard on his belt, which contains a gift from his brother, Resin Bowie, made for just such an occasion as this. Sheathed in the scabbard is a large knife, measuring 9 inches in length and 1.5 inches in width, with a crosspiece set above the handle to stop the user's hand from slipping forward. After Jim Bowie's earlier fight with Major Norris, Resin Bowie had given him the knife as a gift, stating that this weapon would not require loading nor present the danger of misfiring. Now, in a fury, Jim Bowie draws the knife as he pursues Crane, angrily calling out, "Crane, you have shot at me, and I will kill you if I can." Crane, in a panic, and now with no more shots to fire, turns and desperately hurls one of his pistols at Bowie, striking him in the head and nearly buckling the knees of his pursuer. However, Bowie, now in a froth, continues his pursuit, seemingly otherwise unfazed by the vicious blow. Dr. Maddox now rushes to restrain Bowie, but is quickly thrown off. But then, momentarily, Bowie, now feeling the full effects of the vicious blow to his head, staggers to a large driftwood log and leans upon it wearily in an effort to collect his senses. Meanwhile, at the same time, the rest of Crane's friends, including Bowie's hated rival Norris Wright, rush to assist their comrade. Wright approaches the temporarily disoriented Bowie, pistol drawn. Seeing this, Bowie indignantly rebukes him, "You damned rascal, don't you shoot." Seeing Wright approach, one of Bowie's friends hurriedly hands him a loaded pistol, and within seconds, both Wright and Bowie fire at each other from mere yards away. But, again, both shots miss their mark. Now, Wright draws a second pistol, and Bowie, out of arms and ammunition, calls out to his enemy, "Shoot and be damned." Just before Wright has time to shoot, James Denny, also a member of Bowie's party, grabs Bowie by the shirt collars and demands that the violence be stopped here and now. But again, the cries for peace are drowned out in the storm of unfolding violence. As the melee unfolds, shots ring out once more, with George McWhorter, another one of Bowie's friends, firing a shot that strikes Norris Wright in the left side. Wright then fires at Bowie, whose shirt collars are still firmly in the grips of James Denny. The bullet hits Bowie in the chest, puncturing a lung, and tears off one of Denny's fingers in the process. Wright cries out that he has been mortally wounded, but in reality, he has only sustained a flesh wound. Jim Bowie, though bleeding profusely, struggles free from the grips of Denny, and now, in an animalistic fury, pursues his long-hated rival Norris Wright down the beach, with his long blade still glistening in his hand. Bowie manages to catch up to Wright, but just before he can land a fatal blow, 2 more shots ring out from 2 more of Wright's friends, in Alfred and Carrie Blanchard. One of these bullets strikes Bowie in the thigh, bringing him to his knees on a small strip of sandy beach. Now, both Wright and Alfred Blanchard draw their sword canes, a relatively common weapon in the area at the time, and move towards Bowie in hopes of delivering the coup de grace. But, despite repeatedly striking Bowie, neither are able to inflict a mortal wound, as Bowie defends himself with his own blade and by deflecting blows with his arms and hands, incurring several more injuries in the process. The brutal affair reaches a grisly culmination when one of the men's thin swords becomes embedded in Bowie's sternum, bending the blade and rendering it temporarily inextricable. Then, in what was later characterized by one of the witnesses as a, quote, "wonderful exertion," Bowie pulls himself into a seated position, and like a mad tiger swipes at and grasps the collar of Norris Wright, who, in struggling to free himself, inadvertently pulls Bowie to his feet. It is in that instant that Jim Bowie's reputation is solidified forever. According to his own later account, he seethingly whispers to Norris Wright, "Now, Major, you die," before driving the blade deep into his chest, killing him instantly. However, the fight is not over. Now, the body of Norris Wright collapses onto Bowie, pinning him to the ground, as Alfred Blanchard continues to try to inflict a mortal wound on his now trapped opponent. However, by this time, Bowie's friends have made their way to his aid. Now, Thomas Wells fires a shot that strikes Alfred Blanchard in the arm, just as Bowie is able to free himself and scramble to his feet. Bowie then manages to strike one final blow, a nasty gouge to Alfred Blanchard's side, before the melee is finally brought to a halt. In just under 90 seconds, Jim Bowie has incurred several life-threatening wounds, inflicted several himself, and managed to eradicate his longtime enemy. Now, as the effects of his adrenaline begin to fade and the pain of his wounds sets in, Bowie is tended to by several of the physicians present. As the doctors work, Robert Crane, who had first shot Bowie, approaches. Though he had long sought to settle his score with Norris Wright, Bowie and Crane have had no prior history of confrontation nor violence. Now, Bowie calls out to Crane, "For God's sake, Crane, assist me, give me some water, and help me to the shade." Crane, having no personal animosity towards Bowie save for the last few minutes of combat, acquiesces to the request and brings Bowie water, before helping to carry him back to the shade of the island's willow trees. On their way to the trees, Bowie, grateful for the assistance, simply remarks, "Colonel Crane, you ought not to have shot me." In the end, 2 men, ironically, neither the appointed duelists for the day, are killed. From Bowie's party, General Samuel Cooney has died from the gunshot wound inflicted at the hands of Crane, while Major Norris Wright has fallen victim to the soon-to-be legendary blade of Jim Bowie. Alfred Blanchard has been badly injured by a gunshot and the knife wound that Bowie had struck as his final blow in the fight, but he will recover. For his part, Jim Bowie has been grievously injured. He is taken to Vidalia, Mississippi, where he spends 2 months recovering. In the interim, local newspapers begin to run the story of what would come to be known as the Sandbar Fight, already cementing the folkloric nature of Jim Bowie and his deadly knife. Though Bowie will recover, his story does not end here on the shores of the Mississippi. Bowie will go on to live nearly another decade, finally meeting his end at the hands of Santa Anna and the Mexican army in the legendary Battle of the Alamo. While the life of Jim Bowie is one replete with legend and controversy, for tonight, the many tales of his life, as well as the battle in which he died, are other stories for other times. January 23, 1871. Amidst the rolling landscape that surrounds them, on an isolated strip of cattle trail, 3 working cowboys ride west from the town of Weatherford. They are on their way to the ranch of Britton Johnson, better known as Britt Johnson, who rides at the head of the group. They intend to gather Johnson's cattle and make a return trip to sell them in Weatherford. With Johnson are Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford. All 3 men are known and respected locally for their skill as cowhands and their dealings in business. They are all also ex-slaves, officially made American citizens and given their freedom less than a decade earlier. However, despite the tenuous state of the nation in the Reconstruction era, Britt Johnson has built a reputation amongst all peoples of the area as a forthright and upstanding citizen, as well as a local hero. 7 years prior, in the summer of 1864, while still under the bonds of slavery, Johnson had been commissioned by his then master to travel to nearby Parker County to procure supplies for the ranch. Britt Johnson had left his wife and young children with the Fitzpatrick family, trusting that they would be safe from the incessant Comanche and Kiowa raiding that plagued the area at the time. Upon his return, Johnson was met with the horrifying news that the small neighborhood he and his family called home had been laid waste to. His son, Jim, and several members of the Fitzpatrick family had been murdered, and the rest of his family had been kidnapped by Comanche and Kiowa raiders. he had secured written permission from his then master to travel alone on the frontier, a legal necessity at the time, and then ventured out on his own in search of not only his family, but the surviving members of the White Fitzpatrick family as well. After months of tracking, and subsequently working his way into the good graces of the tribes, Johnson had been able to negotiate trades for the return of not only his family, but all of the surviving members that had been taken in what came to be known to history as the Elm Creek Raid. Some members of the tribes, though, regarded his dealings as being underhanded and self-interested, as he had reportedly absconded with more rescued captives than the Kiowa and Comanche had agreed to. Thus, some warriors of both tribes vowed that, should the opportunity ever arise, they would take their retribution on Britt Johnson. Now, 7 years later, Johnson pulls his large horse to a halt, as the men set out to make camp for the night. The trusted steed has been with him since before he ventured out alone in search of his family, and is not only a trusted workmate, but a treasured companion. Scampering around the horse's feet, Johnson's small dog greets his owner as he steps from his saddle to the ground, whimpering and excitedly wagging his tail. Though the scene might appear akin to that of a relatively placid modern-day trail ride, the situation at hand is anything but. Though considerable time has passed since the Elm Creek Raid, hostilities between settlers on the Texas frontier and the mighty Comanche and Kiowa tribes still rage, and any territory between towns and homesteads is considered to be dangerous ground for travelers. All three men, though, are seasoned hands at both working cattle and fighting hostile native tribes. Thus, they carry about their work of setting up camp for the night with a workmanlike deliberation that, to the outside observer, seems wholly untroubled by the potential danger at hand. However, all three men are also heavily armed with repeating rifles and Colt revolvers, a necessity in this territory. They also carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. As the men finish making camp and prepare to bed down for the evening, they notice another group of working cowhands hauling freight to Weatherford, camped roughly a mile and a half away. Thinking themselves to be relatively safe for the night, the men soon drift off to sleep after consuming a cold supper. The next morning, January 24th, arrives with the typical merciless chill that plagues the country throughout the winter. As the morning sun begins to peek over the horizon, Britt Johnson, Dennis Curtin, and Paint Crawford rise and begin to prepare themselves and their horses to move on for the day. However, just as their thoughts begin to drift to preparing breakfast and what the day's travel might hold, the three men in the small camp are startled by the sickening sound of thunderous hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. Looking in the direction of the sound, the three men see an oncoming cloud of 25 Kiowa warriors, bearing down upon their encampment at full speed. The Kiowa are in the area conducting raiding on local homesteads when they have spotted Britt Johnson and company the day prior. Seeking to make good on their old promise of settling their score with Johnson, they now charge upon the camp in full regalia, their war whoops intermittently piercing through the thunderous cacophony of their horses' hoofbeats. Though a completely separate and much smaller tribe than their allies in the Comanche, the Kiowa are just as renowned in this territory for their bravery, horsemanship, and ruthlessness. While the Comanche are known for their Spartan-like ornamentation, though that has begun to change in the latter 19th century, the Kiowa possess a far more complex cultural tapestry of dress, religion, economics, and social structure. The Kiowa that now charge upon the camp are more ornately dressed than their Comanche counterparts, but their tactics, once familiar to Johnson, Curtin, and Crawford, are drawn from the same well of knowledge and experience drawn upon by the Comanche, as well as other Plains tribes. Rather than a head-on charge at the cowhands' campsite, the warriors maneuver forward in a whirling cyclone, in which the rider nearest the target fires his shot, before continuing on to the back of the circle to reload and return for another shot. The whirlwind of bullets and arrows soon encircles the entirety of the small three-man camp, which provides no cover to its inhabitants. Now, the once placid campsite is engulfed in the storm of violence, as all three men scramble for any semblance of cover they can find. They pour fire from their rifles into the thick oncoming Kiowa formation, loosing dozens of rounds in little more than a few minutes. However, essentially caught in the open, Cureton and Crawford are quickly cut down by Kiowa bullets and arrows. With no other options at hand, Britt Johnson draws the large bowie knife he keeps in a scabbard on his belt and, after a heart-wrenching few milliseconds, dispatches his beloved horse with the large steel blade. The hulking animal falls where it had stood, and Johnson takes what sparse cover he can find behind the animal's corpse. Now, aside from his small dog, Britt Johnson is the only remaining member of the camp left alive. From their vantage point roughly a mile and a half away, the team of ranch hands hauling freight to Weatherford can only watch as the fight unfolds, afraid of drawing the much larger Kiowa force's ire upon themselves. They watch, awestruck, as Britt Johnson now fights for his very life in a battle that he very likely knows is lost. However, Johnson fights on with the fury of a man possessed. In a momentary lull in the attack, he scrambles to the bodies of his comrades and procures their firearms and ammunition, before retaking his position behind the body of his horse and continuing to pour fire into the ranks of the Kiowa. With seemingly robotic efficiency, Johnson continues to fire and reload, methodically picking off his attackers as the relentless succession of charges continues. No one can know what thoughts crossed the mind of Britt Johnson during these lonesome, fearful moments. It is a safe assumption, however, that the memories of his beloved wife and children, now only a few dozen miles away, flood his mind. So too might have the memories of his time with the tribes, the killing of his son, and the promises of the disaffected warriors to exact their revenge. Though no one can know his thoughts in his final minutes, Britt Johnson's actions now become the stuff of Texas legend. As the Kiowa warriors dart around him like a swarm of enraged hornets, Johnson gives no quarter and asks for none. Shot after shot rings out, deafening all within earshot as the ground seems to quake with the rumble of the horse's hooves. Finally, though by what means we are unsure, Britt Johnson is struck by either a bullet or an arrow and dealt a mortal wound. Though the onlooking men of the freight hauling detail are unable to discern the moment at which Johnson is killed, they witness the Kiowa swarm his position and know that all is lost for the brave lone cowboy. Hours later, they venture forth to the site of the battle, assured the Kiowa have now left the area. What they find bespeaks a fight and an aftermath that, even on the bleeding edge of the Texas frontier, was unique in both its brutality and its ruthlessness. They find the bodies of Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford where they had fallen, the tops of both their heads freshly scalped. They see the body of Johnson's horse, prostrate in its last act of service, riddled with bullets and pin-cushioned with arrows. Behind the body of the horse, they find Britt Johnson. He has been terribly mutilated, with his face gruesomely disfigured, scalped, and eviscerated. So too has the body of his small but eternally faithful dog, found shoved into Johnson's torso. However, in a testament to Johnson's commitment to fight until the end, 173 cartridges are found scattered around his body. To the men investigating the site, and in the eye of posterity, this is a near unbelievable amount of firepower for one man to have unleashed during a fight that was all but assuredly lost before it even began. In the end, the bodies of Britt Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford are buried in a common grave next to the road near which they fell. A small marker with all three of their names is left at the spot, which is today marked by an official Texas Historic Site marker. Though he was not afforded a major affair for a funeral and was meant to suffer some of the worst indignities wrought upon American citizens within its tumultuous history, Britt Johnson is remembered as a Texas legend and an example to all of what selflessness, determination, and bravery really mean. For their part, the Kiowa would go on to retreat to the northwest, to the vast open plains. Here, they would again join forces with the Comanche in the ensuing 4 years in what would come to be known to history as the Red River War. This war would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for both the Kiowa and the Comanche, two powerful tribes that had been ravaged for decades by warfare and disease. But the many tales of the Red River War as well as the full story of Britt Johnson's one-man ventures to reclaim his family, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a fellow history lover, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to gain early access to episodes, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok, on Instagram, and to subscribe to our newsletter. All the links for those are down below as well. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.